Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into the warm, flickering world of ancient Rome. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meats, fresh bread, and something vaguely fishy that you probably don't want to investigate too closely. You're standing at the edge of the Suburra, one of Rome's most infamous neighborhoods. Crowded, noisy, and alive, with a kind of organized chaos. It's evening, and the city's heartbeat pulses through these twisting streets. Vendors shout their wares from every direction. Children dart between stalls, chasing each other while tired shopkeepers slap at the thick summer flies. You dodge a cart carrying amphorae, tall clay jars of wine, that nearly tips as it rumbles over uneven cobblestones. Somewhere a lute player strums a cheerful tune, entirely drowned out by the merchants bellowing about fresh figs and the best sausage in Rome. Before you go any further though, let's handle something important. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You weave into the market's arteries. The Suburra isn't some distant corner of the city. It's practically its beating heart, wedged right between the grand forums and the emperor's palace. The neighborhood's reputation swings between vibrant and scandalous. Senators live practically next door to pickpockets and street performers. And in between, food. So much food. Under colorful awnings of striped linen stalls are piled high with produce from every corner of the empire. Plump purple grapes from Campania gleam in the lamplight next to pyramids of North African dates. A basket of pomegranates spills over like some still life painting come to life. You run your fingers over a heap of wheat, its golden heads dry and brittle, waiting to be ground into flour. But the produce is only the beginning. The real action lies in the ready-to-eat stalls. In one corner, a grizzled old man grills strips of a spiced meat over glowing embers. You watch fat drip hissing into the coals. The aroma is incredible, equal parts savory and smoky with a faint trace of sweet wine marinade. He sees you eyeing the skewers and winks. Best lamb in Suburra. Cooked fresh, my friend. A few steps away, a younger woman stands behind a wooden table, rolling tiny balls of goat cheese in crushed herbs. She works quickly, expertly coating each ball in crushed thyme and honey. The result looks almost too pretty to eat. But she assures you it's even better in your mouth than in your eyes. You pass a man selling shellfish, their wet shells glistening under flickering oil lamps. Tiny eels twist sluggishly in buckets of water beside piles of mussels and clams. The vendor boasts they were caught just this morning, though judging by the smell, you suspect some were caught a few mornings ago. Then there's the bread. Oh, the bread. Bakers haul fresh loaves out of portable clay ovens, the tops split open like blooming flowers. You watch one customer jab his finger through the crust to test its springiness before handing over a few bronze coins. The baker grins, revealing teeth stained dark by cheap wine. Of course, as you stroll, you can't help but notice the darker undercurrents. The Suburra is vibrant, yes, but also dirty and dangerous. Trash piles up in gutters. Chamber pots are emptied out windows with casual disregard. You dodge one such splash, narrowly earning yourself a muttered apology from an old woman above. Public sanitation wasn't exactly Rome's strong suit despite its grand aqueducts and bathhouses. Historians still argue whether the Suburra was more dangerous at night or during the day. Some describe it as a den of thieves and brawlers. Others insist it was mostly hardworking families trying to scrape by. Likely, it was both depending on which street you were on and whose business you were interfering with. Still, the market remains magnetic. You notice a stall run by an Egyptian vendor hawking something curious, lotus roots, and jars of honey-soaked dates. His accent is thick as he calls out to passers-by, offering authentic delicacies of Alexandria. The cultural mixing pot of Rome bubbles everywhere you look. And yet, as vibrant as this food scene feels, you can't shake a quiet realization that so much of it will one day vanish. Empires fall, cities crumble, tastes change. Many of these recipes will disappear, lost to time, unearthed only by the occasional amphora, buried in ash, or an ancient shopping list, scribbled on a wax tablet. But for now, you walk, breathe in the warm spiced air, and listen to the endless buzz of voices speaking Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and who knows what else. Welcome to Rome Subura, its forgotten food court, its living breathing stomach. You wander deeper into the tangled streets, and your stomach grumbles again as another wave of rich, sweet scents drifts through the night air. This time it's something fried, crisp, and golden, sizzling gently on a wide iron pan, balanced precariously over a smoky fire. The vendor, a wiry man with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive ability to shout over the chaos, calls out to you. Fresh cheese fritters, honey cakes, still hot. The Romans love their street snacks. And right now, you're staring at two of their absolute favorites. On one side of the counter, he carefully flips soft discs of fried cheese, melting creamy insides, wrapped in thin, crispy shells that glisten with olive oil. Beside them, rows of honey cakes cool on a wooden board. They're small, round, and golden brown, glistening as the vendor spoons one final drizzle of wildflower honey across the tops. You pick one up carefully. It's still warm, sticky, and fragrant. The honey carries hints of thyme and lavender buzzing faintly like the bees that made it. You bite into the tender cake, and it practically melts on your tongue, the sweetness, perfectly balancing the gentle crunch of the crust. If there was ever an ancient Roman version of comfort food, this is it. Though the elite dine on exotic dishes, most Romans survived on humble street fare like this simple, portable, affordable. Vendors like this were everywhere, parked at busy intersections, temple steps, and bathhouse exits, catching customers wherever the foot traffic was heaviest. You could easily fill your belly without ever stepping foot into a formal dining room. Of course, not all of these vendors were equally reputable. Food inspectors existed, the ideals, but whether they thoroughly checked every food stall is another debate historians still argue over. Some records suggest they were quite diligent, others that they turned a blind eye for a few coins, slipped discreetly into the folds of their tunics. Judging by the occasional greenish sausage you spot on nearby trays, not every vendor kept their standards high. You move along, stepping carefully to avoid greasy puddles, forming under overflowing clay pots of oil. Next, you spot a stall, preparing a popular morning treat pulse. It's essentially a type of porridge, made from boiled emmer wheat, flavored here with a spoonful of honey and a dash of goat's milk. The vendor stirs the thick mixture with a wooden paddle, humming softly as steam rises around his face. Romans considered this a basic, nourishing meal, what oatmeal might be for you today. The line for the polls is surprisingly long, with customers from every walk of life. A young mother balancing a sleepy child on her hip, a merchant with stained fingers counting coins, even a legionary in partial armor, his helmet tucked under one arm. It's a little reminder that in Rome, Food was one of the few things that could briefly unite every class. And speaking of class, not far from the pools vendor stands a more upscale operation, a man selling sweet wine-soaked dates stuffed with crushed nuts. The vendor's stall is meticulously arranged, the dates shining like little jewels under polished bronze lamps. Imported from Carthage, he boasts, though whether that's true or just good marketing, you'll never know. You nibble one out of curiosity. The sticky sweetness coats your teeth, the crunch of nuts offering a perfect balance. It's worth noting that for many poorer Romans, these types of treats were rare indulgences. Most citizens relied on daily rations of bread and cheap wine, with occasional vegetables or lentils if they could afford it. Meat, that was a luxury unless you counted bits of organ meats or scraps sold at discount stalls. Still, these street snacks offered small moments of affordable pleasure. Historians still debate how much nutritional value the average Roman diet really provided. Some suggest that urban poor suffered from chronic deficiencies, especially in iron and protein, while others argue that Rome's grain-heavy imports and abundant seafood kept most citizens surprisingly well-fed, at least compared to other ancient societies. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the middle. As you continue your stroll, you pass a group of children, clustered around a woman roasting chestnuts over a small brazier. Their laughter fills the air as they eagerly clutch tiny paper cones of the hot, smoky treats. The scene feels timeless. Street food has a way of shrinking the centuries. If you squint, you could almost imagine yourself at a modern street fair. But not everything on these streets is so wholesome. A sharp, tangy smell wafts from a nearby alley, where another vendor is boiling what you're fairly certain are animal intestines. This was another common snack tripe or offal, served in a vinegary broth. You politely decline the vendor's enthusiastic offer to try some, and then, somewhere behind you, a brawl breaks out. Two men shouting over who owes whom money fists, flying bystanders scrambling to get out of the way. Rome's markets could be dangerous not just because of unsanitary food, but because tempers flared as easily as oil ignites. You step aside as a pair of lictors magistrates' bodyguards move in with rods to break it up. Night deepens, but the Subura never really sleeps. Oil lamps glow warmly behind linen curtains. Couples stroll arm in arm. A drunk poet loudly recites verses to no one in particular. And somewhere off in the distance, temple bells chime softly. You continue forward, bellyful, senses overwhelmed, and mind swirling with the rich flavors of ancient Rome. Your path winds through the shifting crowd until you come upon something distinctly different, a small stone building. With an open front, its wide marble countertop stained from countless meals served. This is not a market stall. You've stumbled upon one of Rome's most defining urban features, the Thermopolium. Essentially, ancient Rome's version of the fast food restaurant. The marble counter before you has deep rounded holes, dolia, built right into its surface. These large clay jars sit flush with the countertop holding piping hot stews, broths, and cooked grains. The heat wafts up as you lean closer, carrying rich scents of spiced lentils, boiled chickpeas, and sometimes more questionable fish-based concoctions. A young man with curly hair and quick hands ladles a steaming portion of beans into a simple ceramic bowl for a waiting customer. The transaction is swift. A few bronze coins clink against the counter. The bowl changes hands, and the customer moves to one of the stone benches along the back wall. The place hums with the clatter of utensils and quiet chatter. As people slurp and chew, you watch fascinated as the cook refills one of the dolia with a thick meat stew, ladling it carefully from a large iron cauldron boiling behind him. The meat you notice is mostly cuts. Modern diners would politely decline. Lots of organ meats, bits of cartilage, and chunks of something vaguely resembling tongue. But here it's hot-filling and affordable, and that's what matters. Thermopolia dotted nearly every neighborhood in Rome, particularly in working-class areas like the Subura. For many residents, these eateries weren't just convenient, they were essential. Most insulae, the apartment blocks where the majority of Romans lived, lacked kitchens or had only small hearths unsuitable for serious cooking. Rather than risk burning down the whole building, most people simply ate out. Historians still debate how many thermopolia operated at Rome's peak. Some estimates suggest thousands on nearly every corner in busy districts. Archaeological digs like those at Pompeii have revealed remarkably well-preserved examples, their counters still bearing colorful frescoes advertising the house, specialties, roasted birds, fish platters, jugs of wine. You step closer and notice one such fresco here too. A painted image of a rooster perched on a platter, flanked by jars of olives and a loaf of bread. It's a simple, cheerful sign, promising warm meals for a reasonable price. Marketing, after all, is as old as commerce itself. The clientele fascinates you. Here, a grizzled sailor argues animatedly with a merchant over the price of Egyptian papyrus. There, a couple of young laborers in dusty tunics devour their meals with the kind of speed that suggests they're on a shore lunch break from hauling marble blocks. A prostitute sits in the corner dabbing her lips with a scrap of cloth, while her latest client nurses a mug of cheap wine. Thermopolia blurred class lines, but only to a point. You wouldn't find senators or wealthy patricians dining here. They had private chefs, elaborate dining rooms, and banquets to attend. But for the vast majority of Rome's population, these eateries were the backbone of daily life. The owner of this Thermopolium spots you and offers a grin. First time, try the lentils. Fresh batch today. His voice carries a slight Greek accent, a reminder that much of Rome's urban population consisted of immigrants from across the sprawling empire. You nod politely but decide to observe a bit longer instead. Behind the counter, a teenage boy scrubs clay bowls in a bucket of tepid water. Hygiene standards here were, let's say, relaxed. The Romans had an extensive aqueduct system, yes, but not every Thermopolium invested in constant fresh water. Cross-contamination, probably rampant. Parasites, an occupational hazard. But people still lined up. Hunger tends to outweigh caution. This leads you to another modern debate. Were Thermopolia dangerous health hazards or perfectly adequate by ancient standards? Archaeologists examining ancient latrines suggest that parasites like whipworms and roundworms were common across all social classes, regardless of where they dined. So perhaps these eateries weren't uniquely risky, just part of Rome's wider public health struggles. Your gaze drifts to a corner where two men discuss politics over bowls of barley stew. One gestures angrily, while the other rolls his eyes, muttering something about the grain dole shrinking again. Ah yes, the annona, Rome's subsidized grain program. Keeping Rome's millions fed was a never-ending balancing act of politics, logistics, and occasional corruption. Historians still argue whether the grain dole made the urban poor dependent or simply kept civil unrest at bay. Likely, it did both. Bread and circuses, as the old saying went, were what held the empire together. You leave the Thermopolium and continue your walk, feeling like you've glimpsed not just a restaurant but a microcosm of Roman life. Rich in diversity, buzzing with energy, and precariously balanced on systems that could collapse at any moment. The night grows cooler, and somewhere nearby, a street performer begins juggling flaming torches, drawing cheers from a small crowd. But your journey through Rome's culinary past is far from over. Your stroll leads you away from the bustling Thermopolia and toward another essential corner of Rome's dining culture, the wine bars, or as the Romans called them, popinae. These were places where you didn't necessarily come for the food, though some sold simple snacks, but rather for the endless jugs of cheap, heavily watered wine. And perhaps for a bit of trouble too. You pause at the open doorway of one popina, hearing raucous laughter spill into the street. The interior is dimly lit by oil lamps mounted on the walls. Inside, several wooden tables sag slightly under the weight of ceramic cups and half-eaten plates. The smell hits you like a chariot's sour wine sweat, and a hint of roasted nuts. You take a careful step inside. At the bar, a rough wooden counter, the capo, or tavern keeper, is busy pouring drinks from enormous clay jars known as amphorae. He works quickly, tilting the jars with practiced ease, pouring a thin stream into battered earthenware cups. Every now and then, he pauses to sprinkle in flavorings from a small tray of spices, pepper, myrrh, even pine resin. These additions help disguise the harshness of lower quality wine that's been diluted several times over. Romans rarely drank wine straight. In fact, doing so was considered barbaric, something only uncivilized tribes beyond the empire might indulge in. Proper Romans mixed their wine with water in varying ratios, sometimes as much as 1/3 or 1/4 parts wine to water. The quality of the vintage determined how palatable this mixture was. Judging by the patrons' puckered faces, tonight's batch may not be winning any awards. At a nearby table, a group of off-duty gladiators slap each other on the back, their laughter booming through the small room. One proudly recounts his last match at the Colosseum, while others cheer and knock their cups together in a toast. The conversation gets louder, voices slurring slightly. Fights often broke out in popinae, and you get the sense that tonight might not be an exception. Historians still argue whether popinae were respectable gathering places or dens of vice. Ancient moralists, who were rarely fans of working-class leisure, accused them of encouraging gambling, prostitution, and rowdy drunkenness. But archaeology suggests that for many Romans, these bars were simply practical social hubs, a place to unwind after a long day's labor. You edge toward the back of the room where a lone man sits, hunched over his cup, muttering under his breath. He's playing tesserae, a kind of gambling game involving small ivory or bone dice. With a quick flick of his wrist, he sends the dice tumbling across the table. The tiny cubes clatter noisily, drawing occasional glances from nearby drinkers. Gambling was technically illegal in Rome, but only during certain festivals, and enforcement was sporadic at best. Next to him, a tray of simple bar snacks, salty olives, roasted chickpeas, and wedges of soft cheese wrapped in fig leaves. The salt helps keep patrons thirsty, ensuring they continue ordering more wine. The tavern keeper knows his business. Behind the bar, a small open window offers a view into a tiny kitchen area, where a pot of molten honeyed wine simmers gently over a low flame. This sweeter version of Roman wine was especially popular with those who could afford the extra touch of luxury. Tonight, though, most customers seem content with their watered-down house blend. You glance upward and notice something unsettling. The ceiling is blackened with soot, evidence of years of open flame and poor ventilation. Roman taverns were notoriously smoky, cramped, and fire-prone. More than one popina had met its end in a flash of burning oil and collapsing timber. Suddenly, a burst of shouting erupts at the gladiators' table. Two men leap to their feet, knocking over cups and sending wine sloshing across the floor. A quick scuffle breaks out. Punches throw chairs, scraping other patrons scrambling to avoid spilled drinks. The tavern keeper moves swiftly, shouting curses and waving a thick wooden stick to break it up. You wisely back toward the doorway, slipping into the cool night air. The laughter resumes behind you as if nothing had happened. In ancient Rome, bar fights were just part of the entertainment. Even as you step away, the faint strains of music drift from another popina down the street. Somewhere, a flute player adds a soft melody to the night, accompanied by the rhythmic clapping of patrons keeping time between drinks. You can almost feel the pulse of the city humming under your feet, alive, boisterous, never quite silent. The popinae were the social fabric for Rome's working-class places, where soldiers, tradesmen, laborers, freedmen, and even slaves gathered to exchange news, drown their worries, or simply feel human for a little while. Not so different, perhaps, from corner bars or neighborhood pubs today. But as you walk on, you're reminded once again how fragile this vibrant food and drink culture was. Tied directly to Rome's economic might and sprawling trade networks, its days were always numbered. With every mile of conquered land came new flavors, new goods, and new vulnerabilities. For now, though, the popinae remain open, their laughter echoing down the winding streets long into the night. You drift farther from the noisy popinae, following the aroma of something altogether stranger, something more exotic, even slightly unsettling. Here, tucked into a narrow alleyway, stands a stall unlike any you've seen so far. The vendor, wearing a richly embroidered tunic, far fancier than most market folk, presides over a display of gleaming silver trays arranged like tiny stages for his culinary stars. Laid carefully on one platter are plump dormice, glyers, as the Romans called them, roasted whole, stuffed with minced pork herbs and chopped nuts. Their little legs are crossed politely over their round bellies, as though they'd simply fallen asleep after a rich meal. You pause, eyeing the neatly lined up bodies with an odd mixture of fascination and mild horror. Dormice were an upper-class delicacy, raised in special stone jars called gliraria, a kind of ancient hamster habitat, where they were fattened on acorns and chestnuts before meeting their inevitable fate. Only the wealthiest Romans indulged in such eccentric luxuries. This vendor clearly caters to a higher-paying clientele. Next to the dormice sit small cuts of flamingo tongue, another prized morsel among Rome's elite. The tongues have been marinated in fermented fish sauce and sprinkled with crushed rose petals. The vendor gestures proudly, rare delicacies for refined tastes. He says, his voice oily, with practiced charm. Historians still debate whether flamingo tongue was as widespread as Roman authors like Petronius suggest, or whether it was more an exaggerated symbol of absurd, aristocratic gluttony. Either way, the very fact that anyone consumes such a thing says plenty about the extravagant dining habits of Rome's upper crust. You marvel at the array of options laid out before you: slices of peacock breast, glazed with honey sausages, spiced with imported cinnamon and oysters, displayed on beds of crushed ice, hauled hurriedly from the coast earlier that morning. The logistics of keeping seafood fresh without refrigeration are mind-boggling, and you can't help but admire the sheer determination involved. The vendor catches your eye and lowers his voice. Conspiratorially, "I have crocodile meat too. Straight from Egypt, very exclusive." He winks, tapping the edge of his nose, like he's sharing a secret. Whether or not that particular claim is true is anybody's guess. Romans loved foreign rarities, and vendors often stretched the truth to inflate prices. After all, who could verify whether your crocodile steak had truly traveled up the Nile? This obsession with exotic foods wasn't limited to animals. You spot baskets of imported fruits, dates from Judea, figs from Carthage, and even a small pile of Indian black peppercorns that would have cost a fortune per handful. The Roman elite saw dining not merely as sustenance, but as performance, a chance to display wealth, worldliness, and refined taste all in one course. Historians still argue about the full scale of Rome's food imports. While luxury items like pepper and saffron certainly came from afar, some scholars suggest that accounts of elephants marching through the forum or emperors sipping pearls, dissolved in vinegar, may have been deliberate exaggerations, propaganda to reinforce their semi-divine status. You watch as a well-dressed couple approaches the stall. The man wrapped in a fine woolen toga bordered with purple. The mark of senatorial rank inspects the dormice carefully, while his companion fans herself against the warm breeze. After a brief negotiation, a deal is struck. A slave steps forward to carry their gleaming parcel away. As you continue your walk, you begin to notice the subtle divide that runs through Rome's culinary world. The common citizens crowded into Thermopolia and Popinae to eat their lentils and stewed vegetables. Meanwhile, the elites orchestrated elaborate feasts featuring imported wonders, orchestrated by teams of skilled slaves called koki, full-time personal chefs who managed entire kitchen staffs. And these grand feasts weren't simply private affairs. Invitations to a banquet could secure political alliances, reward loyal clients, or showcase an aristocrat's power. Meals lasted for hours, sometimes days, moving from course to course as live musicians performed, acrobats entertained, and poets recited flattering verses. It's said that Emperor Vitellius once hosted a banquet with over 2,000 different dishes. Whether that number is exaggerated or not, you suspect the guests barely noticed after the first 100 courses or the 10th cup of spiced wine. But amid all this opulence, there was always the lurking possibility of disaster. Food poisoning, after all, didn't discriminate. Without modern refrigeration or proper knowledge of bacterial contamination, even the most decadent spread could leave a senator doubled over in agony. You pause for a moment, reflecting on the sheer contrast between the Subura's fried cheese and this Ali's stuffed dormice. Yet both belong to the same world, bound together by Rome's insatiable appetite for food. Yes, but also for spectacle. A warm breeze carries the mingled aromas of honeyfish sauce and roasted meats as you step back into the main thoroughfare. Somewhere nearby, temple bells toll the hour, blending into the gentle din of the eternal city, a place where food itself is an empire. You wander now toward a much less glamorous but no less essential corner of Rome's culinary empire, the garum factories. Even before you arrive, the sharp, unmistakable smell hits you like a slap. Fermented fish sauce, pungent, salty, aggressively alive in the air. Your nose wrinkles instinctively. This is garum, the liquid gold of Roman kitchens. The factory sits near the city's outskirts, where the stench would theoretically disturb fewer citizens. Large vats stand open beneath the sun, their contents slowly bubbling under layers of linen covers. Inside these vats, a gruesome stew of fish, guts, blood-whole anchovies, salt, and sometimes herbs decomposes over weeks or months. The hot Mediterranean sun does most of the work. The workers move briskly, shoveling piles of tiny fish into fresh vats, while others carefully stir the older ripening batches. They wear simple tunics, stained permanently dark by brine, their bare feet caked in dried salt. You watch as one worker lifts a ladleful of the amber-brown liquid and examines it with a practiced eye before pouring it into waiting amphorae. The end product may smell like a crime scene in progress, but once strained and aged, garum becomes Rome's most prized condiment, used in everything from stews to desserts. It delivers that savory punch, the original umami that Roman taste buds craved. Historians still argue whether all Romans genuinely enjoyed garum, or if some simply tolerated it as a cultural staple. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder sang its praises, but you suspect that not every citizen relished quite so much rotting fish in their stew. You glance at the tall stacks of amphorae, nearby each sealed with clay plugs and marked with the factory's stamp. Some are destined for local markets, others for ships that will carry them across this empire, north to Gaul, east to Judea, even as far west as Britannia, where chilly outposts of Roman soldiers will season their barley porridge with this precious liquid reminder of home. The economic machinery behind garum was astonishing. Entire towns along the coast of Spain, North Africa, and southern Italy thrived solely on its production. These were full-blown industrial operations producing thousands of amphorae annually. Some brands like the famous Garum Sociorum were considered luxury products, fetching steep prices in elite markets. A worker offers you a small taste an olive soaked in garum. You hesitate but accept. The flavor is intense. Salty, yes. Fishy, definitely. But beneath that initial punch lies something oddly rich, even addictive. You can suddenly understand why so many recipes called for it. Nearby, a scribe sits at a rough table tallying production records onto wax tablets. Commerce like this didn't run on trust alone. Shipments had to be recorded, taxes assessed, contracts negotiated. Even in the world of fermented fish sauce, bureaucracy reigned supreme. You glance toward the harbor beyond where cargo vessels bob gently at their moorings. Some are already being loaded with crates of olive oil, amphorae, of wine sacks of grain, and of course, garum. The Roman appetite wasn't limited by geography. If something could be moved by cart or ship, it found its way here. Historians still debate whether Rome's food system was brilliantly efficient or dangerously overextended. The sheer volume of imports needed to feed the empire left Rome vulnerable to crop failures, piracy, and political upheaval. But for now, the ships keep coming and the garum factories keep churning. As you turn to leave, you spot one final curiosity, a small altar tucked beside the main vat. On it lies an offering, a cluster of figs, a jug of wine, and a few copper coins. Even in this pungent corner of the empire, the gods were not forgotten. Perhaps a humble plea to Neptune for a safe fishing season, or to Mercury for smooth trading winds. The breeze shifts as you walk away, mercifully clearing the air. The scent of honey cakes and roasted chestnuts reemerges from the city beyond, washing away the briny assault of the garum yard. Rome's food world, you realize, was not just about banquets and bustling markets. It was also about quiet, gritty industry, the unseen hands who mixed, packed, chipped, and salted their way into the history books. You step back into the main roads, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. And still the streets pulse with energy. The eternal feast of Rome continues. The evening breeze carries you toward another vital artery. In Rome's food supply, the bakeries. You hear them before you see them, the hollow thud of kneaded dough, the crackle of fire roaring in clay ovens, and the rhythmic clatter of millstones, grinding grain into flour. This is the daily heartbeat of the Roman diet. Bread. You round a corner into a wide courtyard, dominated by a public bakery. Massive rotary millstones stand like great gray mushrooms, powered not by water or animals tonight, but by slaves slowly pushing wooden beams in endless circles. Their feet shuffle across packed dirt muscles, straining under steady methodical exertion. The grindstones scream softly as they turn reducing wheat into fine powder. Historians still argue about the exact proportion of grain milled privately versus in state-controlled bakeries. But one thing is clear, the city's dependence on bread was absolute. Without these mills, Rome would starve. You watch as the flour is scooped into large woven baskets and carried toward rows of bakers. Some mix it with water and leaven, others knead and shape the soft dough into smooth uniform rounds. These aren't elaborate artisan loaves, they're panes quadratus, Rome's standard round bread stamped with dividing lines to portion easily. Simple, functional, life-sustaining. The ovens themselves are impressive. Great dome kilns, built from bricks glowing orange at their mouths. The bakers work quickly, sliding wooden paddles under rising loaves, rotating them, just so coaxing perfect crusts from searing stone. The smell, oh the smell, fills the entire district thick and warm like a woolen blanket. The aroma of survival. Nearby, you see stacks of flat discs, ready for tomorrow's Annona distributions, the state grain dole that fed hundreds of thousands of Rome's poorer citizens. You can almost feel the weight of empire resting on these loaves. Every shipload of Egyptian grain, every laborer here, every turn of those grinding stones, all feeding into one fragile system, designed to keep the masses content. The grain dole was one of Rome's most sophisticated social programs. At its height, over 200,000 citizens received free monthly rations. But this wasn't pure charity. It was political necessity. Bread kept riots at bay. Bread bought votes. Bread preserved emperors. Some scholars argue that Rome's rulers offered the Annona not out of generosity but sheer pragmatism. Without it, the sprawling metropolis would descend into chaos within days. Others point to moments of genuine civic pride, when emperors personally funded additional grain imports during crises. As always, Rome's motives were a cocktail of self-interest and public spectacle. You step aside as a small group of customers approaches, exchanging tokens for their rationed loaves. An official stands nearby, carefully tallying the transactions onto his wax tablet. Order must be maintained even in bread lines. You notice that not everyone receives bread. Only registered citizens qualified for the annonata. Foreigners, freedmen, and slaves fended for themselves. Some worked for bakeries directly. Others scrounged from the surplus markets where leftover loaves were sold at slightly higher prices. A young boy balances a stack of hot loaves on his head, carefully weaving through the crowd toward a waiting customer. His cheeks are flushed from the oven's heat, his bare feet black with soot. This was how many children learned their trade by carrying, fetching, and sweating alongside adults in the hot belly of Rome's food machine. And yet, not every bakery operated at such an industrial scale. You pass smaller private bakeries. Tucked into alleyways, their ovens smaller, but their loaves often finer flavored with honey sesame or dried fruits for wealthier clientele. Even here, though, the constant danger of fire looms. One overturned oil lamp, one spark near dry flour, and entire blocks could vanish overnight. In fact, several devastating fires swept through Rome's insulate neighborhoods, their origins often blamed on careless bakers. Regulations were eventually introduced to limit oven sizes within city walls, but enforcement was spotty. Bread was too important to halt production entirely. As you leave the courtyard, you spot a faded public notice, tacked to a stone wall, an edict listing maximum prices for bread, wine, and oil. The government regularly intervened to control prices, attempting to prevent greedy merchants from exploiting shortages. Inflation, after all, was an ever-present threat in an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Historians still debate how successful these price controls really were. Some argue they stabilized key markets. Others say they simply drove trade underground. Either way, the constant tug-of-war between supply, demand, and politics played out daily in Rome's markets. You breathe deeply one last time, savoring the lingering scent of baked wheat before the cooler evening air begins to dilute it. The bakeries never truly stop. Even while the rest of Rome sleeps or drinks or feasts, someone somewhere is kneading the dough for tomorrow's loaves. The city pulses forward, sustained by simple bread and complicated politics. And your journey continues. As you slip away from the rhythmic heat of the bakeries, you turn into a quieter part of the city, though quiet in Rome still means occasional shouts, clanging pots, and the distant sound of a street musician trying his luck. Now you find yourself wandering into one of the countless insula, the towering apartment blocks that house the majority of Rome's population. The buildings rise several stories above you, their wooden balconies leaning at precarious angles, their plaster walls cracked and flaking from years of heat, rain, and heavy use. The higher you go, the cheaper and more dangerous the apartments become. Fires, collapses, and even simple accidents were tragically common in these crowded, poorly maintained structures. Historians still argue whether the insula were feats of engineering brilliance or disasters waiting to happen. Likely both. They allowed Rome to pack over 1 million residents into a relatively small footprint, but at considerable cost to safety and comfort. You step carefully through a narrow doorway into one such building. The air inside is close and heavy, thick with the layered scents of countless dinners being prepared in cramped, shared kitchens. You climb the creaking stairs, the wood worn, smooth by generations of sandaled feet. Behind thin curtains you glimpse families huddled over small hearths or portable braziers. There are no proper kitchens here, no counters, no running water, no ventilated chimneys. Just small iron tripods holding clay pots over glowing coals, balanced precariously on wooden floors. Tonight's menu simple and familiar. A mother stirs a pot of poles. That same wheat porridge you saw earlier in the streets, thickened now with lentils, garlic, and a dash of oil. Beside her, a teenage boy slices dried figs into the mixture. His knife dull but practiced. Not far away, a neighbor roasts onions over a tiny flame. The smoke escaping through an open window, or at least most of it does. You cough gently as the haze hangs in the narrow corridor. And yet, despite the smoke and the heat, There's a cozy rhythm to these humble preparations. Survival distilled into routine. A young girl offers you a cup of watered wine tart, and thin but refreshingly cool. For most residents of the insulae, meals were modest affairs, focused on affordability and sustenance rather than flavor. Meat was rare. Fish, eggs, or cheese were occasional treats. The majority lived on grains, legumes, and whatever seasonal vegetables they could afford. And yet, within these tight spaces, you hear laughter, quiet songs, and snippets of conversation in multiple languages. Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and various regional dialects swirl together in the air like spices in a pot. Rome, after all, was the empire's magnet. Refugees, freedmen, merchants, and laborers poured in from across its vast territories, each bringing culinary fragments from their homelands. You spot a man carefully preserving olives in brine, his ceramic jars lined neatly against the wall, a small luxury prepared with care to stretch through the leaner months ahead. In another corner, someone wraps small bundles of herbs to dry thyme bay and coriander traded in the marketplaces earlier that day. Historians still debate whether the insular dwellers felt more oppressed by poverty or sustained by a community. Many lived hand-to-mouth, vulnerable to illness, eviction, or sudden disaster. Yet the tight quarters also bred close bonds, shared meals, and mutual dependence. In one apartment, a woman ladles soup into wooden bowls for a group of elderly tenants who live alone. Her small act of generosity feels timeless, a reminder that food has always been more than nourishment. It's a language of care. You glance up toward the roof where several residents gather around makeshift gardens, small pots of herbs, beans, climbing wooden poles, even a chicken or two, scratching nervously. Every square inch of usable space is maximized. Urban farming long before the term existed. But even these rooftop refuges are precarious. The higher floors sway faintly in the wind, and the risk of collapse grows with every added story. Fires remain an ever-present threat. One careless ember could devour the building in minutes. You make a mental note not to linger too long. As you step outside again, the sky has deepened into a rich indigo. The streets are quieter now, though not silent. The city breathes in layers, some preparing for sleep, others just beginning their night shifts. Vendors pack up their stalls. Children chase each other under torchlight. And somewhere, temple bells mark the changing hour. You pause, breathing in the mixture of smoke, oil, bread, and humanity. This, not the marble forums or gilded palaces, is the Rome where most lived and ate. A city of makeshift kitchens, borrowed recipes, and daily improvisation. The grandeur of banquets may fill the history books, but it's these humble meals, prepared in creaking wooden rooms, that truly fed the empire. The narrow streets open once again, and your feet lead you toward one of Rome's grander spectacles, where food wasn't just about survival, but about status, power, and indulgence, the lavish banquets of the elite. You approach a domus, a wealthy household. Their entrance is marked by towering columns and finely carved marble reliefs. Two slaves stand at the doorway, their expressions carefully neutral, as they eye arriving guests. You slip inside behind a pair of toga-clad senators, allowing yourself a glimpse into a world far removed from the smoky kitchens of the insulae. The atrium gleams under oil lamps, their flickering light bouncing off polished mosaics that depict mythological scenes, gods, lounging nymphs, dancing animals frozen mid-leap. The air is heavy with perfume, crushed roses, frankincense, and a hint of fresh pine needles scattered along the floor for fragrance. You follow the murmurs of conversation toward the dining room, the triclinium, This is where Rome's powerful gathered to perform their nightly ritual of excess. 3 couches form a horseshoe around a low table overflowing with delicacies. Reclining on the couches, the guests lean on one elbow as slaves circulate filling cups and presenting courses. The first tray arrives, carried by a young servant whose face betrays not even a flicker of emotion as he presents it. Peacock eggs, served in tiny silver cups, sprinkled with black pepper and finely ground salt. The guests nod approvingly. Then come whole roasted songbirds, their tiny bodies delicately arranged atop nests of honey-soaked barley. You win slightly, but the guests tear into them with the detached enthusiasm of veterans. For the Roman elite, variety and novelty were as important as taste. Historians still argue whether these accounts of wild excess, vomiting rooms, 20-course feasts, pearls dissolved in vinegar, are exaggerations from moralizing authors or faithful records of the truly absurd. Probably a bit of both. But there's no denying that wealth in Rome could be measured one exotic dish at a time. The next course arrives with theatrical flair boars stuffed with live thrushes so that when sliced, the birds fly out in a flurry of wings and startled squawks. The room erupts in laughter. You resist the urge to step back as feathers swirl past your face. And then the garum arrives. You recognize its sharp scent instantly poured here into tiny glass bottles to be drizzled over nearly every course. Even in the highest circles, the fermented fish sauce remains indispensable. A senator beside you jokes that no dish is truly Roman without it. Between courses, musicians play soft melodies on lutes and flutes their notes, weaving into the hum of conversation. In one corner, a poet stands ready to recite verses honoring the host, while a trained acrobat balances precariously on stacked amphorae. To polite applause. It's important to remember that these feasts were more than just gluttony. They were politics. Invitations to such gatherings weren't extended lightly. To be here was to be seen, to forge alliances, to whisper rumors, to exchange favors. As you listen, you catch snippets of conversation about upcoming grain shipments from Egypt, disputes in the Senate, and quiet speculation about who might fall out of imperial favor next. Deals are being made between sips of honeyed wine and bites of partridge. The next course arrives on a litter, carried by 4 slaves, an enormous platter, holding an entire fish, stuffed with oysters and sea urchins, its scales glazed to shimmer like molten silver. The presentation is stunning. The guests cheer lightly. The host beams. And yet, as impressive as these dishes are, they often mask Rome's food anxieties. Securing enough grain for the city required complex shipping routes, steady political control, and vast networks of storage. One bad harvest, one storm at sea, and these banquets could turn into anxious rationing. Historians still debate whether Rome's logistics were a marvel of centralized efficiency or an unsustainable gamble balanced on constant military expansion. The sheer scale of resources funneled into the capital remains staggering. As the feast continues, more unusual items appear: sea anemones marinated in wine, jellyfish prepared in vinegar, and dormice rolled in poppy seeds. You notice that few plates are actually finished. Much of the food is tasted, commented upon, then waved away as the next course appears. The infamous vomitoria, those mythical special rooms where guests, supposedly purged mid-feast to make room for more, weren't real. The term actually refers to exit corridors in amphitheaters. Still, the popular image endures. because it captures something true about Rome's elite. Their banquets were meant to dazzle, not necessarily to nourish. As the evening winds on, entertainment grows bawdier. Dancers perform routines, somewhere between art and scandal, while comedians trade jabs that earn knowing chuckles and glances. The wine flows freely, and the conversations grow louder. You quietly step away back into the cooler air of the atrium. The laughter and music echo behind you as you exit through the marble doorway and return to the street, leaving behind a world where food serves not just the stomach but the ego. Outside, the night air feels lighter scented once again with the humble street foods of the Subura. Rome contains multitudes, and its food courts, both humble and grand, reflect every layer of its sprawling society. The marble opulence fades behind you as your sandals carry you onward, back into the humbler arteries of Rome's nighttime maze. But even far from the gleaming banquet halls, one problem remains. How do you keep food fresh in a world without refrigeration? You soon find yourself in a small plaza where several vendors and servants are gathered discussing one of Rome's most overlooked culinary arts, food preservation. Their methods, though primitive by modern standards, are surprisingly sophisticated. Everything here is about defeating the clock and the heat. First, you pass a merchant carefully stacking amphorae filled with pickled vegetables. Large ceramic jars are packed tight with cucumbers, onions, cabbages, and even garlic bulbs, all submerged in vinegar brine. Salt is added not only to enhance flavor, but to kill off the nastier microbes lurking unseen. Pickling was an easy, reliable way to preserve produce for weeks or even months. Beside him, another vendor sells smoked meats. You watch as cured cuts of pork and goat are hung on wooden racks, their exteriors dark and slightly glossy from hours spent above slow-burning fires. The smoke acts as both preservative and seasoning, infusing the meat with a rich, savory flavor that's hard to resist. You pause near a woman folding dried figs into woven palm baskets. The figs are shriveled but sweet, their sugars naturally preventing spoilage. She offers you one with a knowing smile. You chew, tasting concentrated sweetness and a hint of fermentation. Like nature's candy, thick, chewy, almost honey-like. Historians still argue how effective these preservation methods really were across the sprawling empire. Some evidence suggests that foodborne illness remained rampant, while others point out that these preservation techniques supported armies, merchant fleets, and distant garrisons year-round. Next, you're drawn towards something even more unexpected, a vendor selling what appears to be snow. Indeed, small blocks of packed ice glisten under oil lamps wrapped in straw-filled crates. Straight from the mountains, he boasts. Stored since last winter. This is Rome's version of refrigeration, imported mountain snow and ice, harvested during colder months and buried deep underground in insulated pits called niboria. Carefully managed, these icy treasures could last for months, precious enough to chill wine or cool a decadent dessert at a wealthy man's summer feast. Of course, this service wasn't exactly for the average citizen. Only Rome's wealthiest households could afford to have snow delivered in the middle of a Mediterranean summer. Still, its existence speaks to the extremes the Romans went to for culinary luxury. You turn the corner and nearly trip over a small cart loaded with tightly sealed clay jars. A man nearby explains that inside are salted fish, salsamentum, a poor man's protein that could last for months if properly prepared. Anchovies, sardines, and mackerel were gutted, layered with coarse salt, and left to ferment into something not unlike garum but thicker, chunkier, and cheaper. Salt itself was a highly prized commodity. You recall how Rome's famous Via Salaria, the salt road, served as a major trade artery long before the empire rose to power. The word salary even derives from salarium, a soldier's allowance for purchasing salt. Historians still debate just how tightly controlled salt production was under imperial rule. Some argue it was one of Rome's most carefully guarded resources, while others suggest local markets thrived in relative independence. Further along, you stumble upon a small side stall, selling tightly wound bundles of dried herbs, rosemary, thyme, oregano, and savory. These not only flavored food, but also acted as natural preservatives when added to oils, vinegars, and pickling mixtures. Romans didn't fully understand microbial science, of course, but they knew what worked at least most of the time. As you pause, a young woman carefully dips linen-wrapped cheeses into large jars of olive oil. The oil forms a protective seal, preserving the soft cheeses for weeks. The resulting product will be tangy, creamy, and highly sought after at tomorrow's forum stalls. You realize how many small hands are involved in keeping Rome's stomach full. Farmers, hunters, salt, miners, ice harvesters, fishers, and spice merchants, all linked by the unspoken fear of scarcity. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a daily gamble. And yet somehow this complicated system mostly worked. Rome endured for centuries, feeding not just itself but also exporting its culinary expertise to every corner of its empire. As the wind shifts again, you catch the sharp metallic tang of iron, mingling with the softer smells of preserved fruit and smoked meat. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith hammers out new tools for farmers and butchers alike. Yet another cog in this vast, invisible machine. Rome's food courts may have bustled in daylight with fresh produce and cooked meals, but behind the scenes, these preservation techniques quietly sustain the empire day after day, season after season. Your feet continue forward, guided by the dim lanterns flickering ahead. Somewhere, a baker is already kneading tomorrow's dough. Somewhere, a fisherman is hauling tomorrow's catch. And somewhere, a snow harvester waits for winter's return. The Eternal City, after all, never really sleeps. The dim lantern light draws you into another narrow side street where something deliciously familiar wafts through the night air. You follow your nose that reliable Roman compass and find yourself standing before a portable oven mounted on a wooden cart. Here in the shadows, a traveling pie seller works his modest but ingenious trade. The vendor greets you with a nod, barely looking up as he tends to his compact brick oven. Inside, small meat pies bake over glowing coals. The crusts are golden, their edges crimped by hand. Every few minutes, he rotates the pies with an iron spatula, ensuring even cooking without burning the undersides. His movements are efficient, practiced. This is far from his first night on these streets. A small cluster of customers gathers a pair of young laborers, a courier, wiping sweat from his brow, and a weary mother, clutching a toddler against her hip. The line moves quickly. A few sesterces change hands. Steaming hot pies slide into crude paper wrappers, made of discarded wax tablets, or reused parchment scraps. No branding, no menus, no receipts, just hot food fast. Historians still argue whether these traveling vendors were licensed or tolerated as unofficial fixtures. Some claim city officials regularly fined or relocated them to control congestion, while others suggest that so long as no major disturbances arose, most were left to operate freely. The vendor glances up at you and gestures toward his remaining pies. Goat and onion tonight. Fresh, very fresh. His grin shows he knows that's both a selling point and a polite lie. You accept a small pie, the crust, still radiating warmth through the thin wrapping. You bite in carefully. The filling bursts with savory juices rich with ground goat meat, caramelized onions, and just a hint of coriander seed. Simple, hearty, and if you don't think too hard about how fresh that goat actually was, quite satisfying. Beyond the pie cart, another vendor roasts sausages on a small iron grate. The fat hisses and pops as he turns them with wooden tongs. You catch the sweet scent of fennel seeds and pepper mingling with the pork as smoke curls upward. He works quickly splitting flatbread rolls and tucking the sizzling sausages inside for easy handling. Roman street food, you realize, was as much about portability as taste. Even in ancient times, time was money. The bustling life of merchants, dockworkers, couriers, soldiers, and artisans rarely allowed for lengthy meals. A hot pie or sausage sandwich bought on the go offered a fast-filling solution. The original grab and go. Nearby, a young girl balances a woven basket filled with boiled eggs and pickled vegetables, hawking them to passers-by. Her father likely owns the tiny family operation, sending his children out to cover more territory. The eggs, still warm, are sprinkled with coarse salt and wrapped in vine leaves to keep them moist. You can't help but admire the resourcefulness on display. In a city where wealth concentrated at the very top, these small vendors found ways to carve out their modest livings, feeding the working masses one snack at a time. Historians still debate how heavily the state intervened in this informal economy. While the grand markets were regulated with posted price edicts, these mobile vendors operated in the gray zones, skimming coins where they could and disappearing when city guards came sniffing for bribes. Further down the alley, you spot yet another food cart, this one selling flatbreads smeared with garlic and fish sauce. Spread a kind of proto-pizza, you muse. The bread cooked quickly on a flat iron pan blisters and crisps at the edges. The vendor sprinkles fresh, chopped herbs, perhaps lovage or rue, and serves it hot to a soldier who tears into it immediately, sighing with satisfaction. You notice that while the clientele here are mostly working-class men, there's a surprising mix of professions: armorers, apprentices, bricklayers, message runners, even a few musicians wrapping up their evening gigs. Rome's working world may have been rigid in status, but everyone shared this late-night hunger. One older man nurses a wooden cup of posca, a common drink for soldiers and laborers, made by mixing sour wine with water and a splash of vinegar. It's sharp, bracing, and just acidic enough to quench thirst after salty street food. Not exactly vintage Falernian, but it does the job. As you observe, a stray cat slinks through the vendor stalls, sniffing for scraps beneath the carts. The vendor flicks a few breadcrumbs toward it without breaking his rhythm. Even the animals of Rome have learned the routines of these mobile kitchens. The longer you watch, the more you realize how closely this world resembles something very modern: food trucks. Rome, in its own way, invented them long before engines, stainless steel, or health inspectors ever existed. And like food trucks today, these rolling kitchens provided variety, flexibility, and affordable comfort in an often chaotic city. The night grows cooler now, the crowds thinning slightly. The vendors start packing up coals extinguished with careful splashes of water, leftover pies wrapped for tomorrow. Carts slowly wheeled toward their storage spots. Another successful night in the silent churning machinery that keeps Rome fed. You step away, your belly full and your mind spinning with the cleverness of these humble food entrepreneurs. Rome's wealthiest citizens may have gorged on flamingo tongues and stuffed dormice, but it's the pie sellers and sausage hawkers who fed the real beating heart of the eternal city. And so you continue deeper into the city that never quite sleeps and certainly never stops eating. As you move onward, full from your recent sampling, the scents of meat pies and grilled sausages fade behind you, replaced by something subtler, a rich, creamy tang that floats on the cool breeze. You follow it instinctively drawn into one of the quieter market lanes where the art of Roman cheesemaking continues under the flickering glow of oil lamps. A small stall stands before you, its wooden tables lined with wheels and blocks of various cheeses, each wrapped carefully in linen or stored in terracotta jars. The vendor, an older woman with sun-baked skin and calloused hands, works with calm efficiency, slicing wedges for curious buyers while keeping one eye on her inventory. Behind her, apprentices turn wheels on their sides, rubbing them with oil to prevent cracking. You approach, and she nods, proud of her craft. "Sheep's milk today," she says softly from Sabina. "Richer than last week's. The goats have been restless." She offers you a small sample. Creamy, dense, slightly salty with that unmistakable grassy note. Unique to well-tended flocks. The Romans, you realize, were masters of dairy long before modern cheese boards existed. From fresh, soft curds to aged wheels, cheesemaking was both science and tradition. Sheep and goats provided most of the milk. Cows were less common, often reserved for labor or slaughter, rather than daily milking. Historians still argue over the full range of Roman cheese varieties. We have records from writers like Columella and Pliny the Elder, describing dozens of types from soft Caseus recens to harder, sharper cheeses, suitable for long storage. Some were flavored with herbs like thyme and fenugreek. Others were aged in clay pots buried underground, their rinds slowly toughening in cool, dark cellars. As you watch a younger apprentice lifts a basket of fresh curds from a vat the Milky Way, still dripping between the woven reeds. The curds are delicate and warm, destined to become caseus mollis, fresh cheese meant to be eaten quickly, often with honey or fruit. Further along the table, small rounds of smoked cheese sit beside stacks of salted dried cheeses wrapped tightly in linen. Each has its market, the fresh cheeses sold to city dwellers. For immediate meals, the salted ones traded to soldiers and merchants for journeys where spoilage would otherwise be certain. A merchant stops by and purchases several wheels for shipment north, likely toward the legionary outposts stationed along the Rhine or Danube. Cheese traveled surprisingly well, offering vital protein and fat to soldiers far from the comforts of Rome. You note that not all of these wheels are created equally. The finest were likely destined for banquet tables, paired with honey-glazed fruits, or drizzled with imported date syrup. Others would crumble into gruel for the poor or soldiers, rations nourishment without pretense. In fact, cheese even played a role in religious rituals. Offerings of Cassius were occasionally placed at temple altars, left for gods who one imagines appreciated a well-aged wheel as much as any mortal. Pliny mentions cheeses from as far as the Alps being highly prized offerings for such occasions. Historians still debate how the widespread use of cheese intersected with Rome's nutrition. Some suggest dairy helped prevent certain nutrient deficiencies, while others point out that excessive salt content may have contributed to rising health issues in aging patricians prone to gout and other afflictions. As you linger, you notice another intriguing feature of this trade, the subtle but critical role of women. While many food industries in Rome were dominated by men, bakers, butchers, fishmongers, cheesemaking often remained firmly in the hands of wives, widows, and female slaves. It was one of the few trades where women controlled, not just production, but often sales as well. An elderly woman nearby counts her earnings quietly while her granddaughter rubs olive oil into another wheel, ensuring its preservation for later market days. The rhythm of their work is smooth, practiced knowledge passed down through generations. As you step away from the stall, your mind drifts to Rome's wider dairy trade. Herds of sheep graze the hills of Latium, Etruria, and Campania, tended by shepherds who rarely visited the city itself but whose labor fed its insatiable appetite. Livestock auctions outside the city walls buzz with activity each season, ensuring fresh supplies for cheesemakers throughout the year. You catch one last glance at the fading market as the vendors begin to close up for the night. Cloth coverings are drawn over the cheese wheels and apprentices snuff out oil lamps, leaving only the faintest golden glow. Yet even as the stalls darken, you know that somewhere nearby, more curds are being stirred, more wheels rubbed and turned, more brines prepared for tomorrow's hungry mouths. The city hums on around you, never truly resting, always preparing for the next day's feeding of its millions. Bread and cheese, simple yet irreplaceable, form the quiet foundation beneath Rome's towering grandeur. And with that thought, you continue your journey through this living, breathing machine of culinary ingenuity. The night deepens, yet Rome remains restless, like some enormous creature whose stomach never fully sleeps. You drift now toward the city's outer limits, where the din of commerce softens into the grittier rhythm of marching boots and clinking armor. Here, food takes on an entirely different character, shaped not by indulgence or artistry, but by necessity. You've arrived at the world of the Roman military and its rations. You join a group of legionaries, stationed at a supply depot, their leather sandals scraping against packed earth as they unload crates from a recently arrived cart. Unlike the bustling markets and colorful stalls you've seen, there's little flair here. Just crates, sacks, amphorae, and the unmistakable smell of damp grain sacks stacked beneath linen tarps. A centurion barks instructions, while soldiers carry bundles of dried meat, amphorae of wine, and stacks of hardtack, the staple of the Roman soldier's diet, known as butellatum. These dense dry biscuits could last for months without spoiling. You tap one lightly. It feels like stone. It wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to survive. Historians still debate whether Roman rations were well balanced or barely sufficient. The army's diet was practically high in carbohydrates for energy, fortified by salted meats, cheese, and pulses when available. Fresh produce, only if luck or local markets allowed. A soldier near you unwraps his meal, a simple mash of barley porridge, polls military, bulked up with lentils and flavored with a splash of sour wine. He stirs it with a wooden spoon, scooping out small bites while half listening to a younger recruit prattle about the latest rumors from Germania. The military, you realize, didn't rely on street vendors or traveling pie sellers. Wherever the army marched, food had to follow or precede it. Massive logistical chains moved supplies from Rome's central granaries to outposts, stretching from Britain to Syria. When campaigns pushed into enemy territory, soldiers often foraged or requisitioned supplies from local populations willingly or otherwise. Nearby, a small camp kitchen operates under a canvas tarp. Several colognes non-combatant camp followers work at large clay pots, boiling cuts of salted pork into stews, flavored with whatever herbs could be scrounged. The smell is hearty, earthy, far from the elaborate perfumes of patrician banquets, but warm and filling in the cool night air. One soldier laughs as he pulls a strip of salted beef from a drying rack. "Last year's vintage," he jokes. His comrades chuckle and raise their wooden mugs of posca, the sour wine-water vinegar mixture that became the military's primary beverage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was cheap, safe to drink, and easier to store than clean water. Historians still argue whether Roman military logistics were truly as sophisticated as surviving records suggest. Some marvel at the efficiency of supply lines, stretching thousands of miles. Others point to chronic shortages, mutinies over spoiled grain, and desperate field improvisations when planned deliveries failed. The legions often brought their own small herds of livestock when marching, goats, sheep, and sometimes cattle. Accompanied columns serving both as walking food supplies and mobile milk producers for cheese and curds along the way. At night, these animals grazed just outside camp walls, closely guarded both for their value and to prevent thieves or predators from cutting into the food chain. You watch as one soldier sharpens his knife beside a small roasting spit where thin strips of goat meat slowly turn. It's a modest treat, likely bartered from a local farmer or gathered as spoils. His companions crowd around as the fat drips into the embers, hissing and spitting softly in the still air. While the legions prided themselves on discipline and order, their cooking often relied on improvisation. Spices and luxuries from Rome rarely made it to the frontier. Instead, soldiers developed simple tricks: wild garlic, gathered from fields, nuts, cracked open by riverbeds, herbs, snatched from village gardens. You spot a worn leather pouch hanging from one soldier's belt. Inside are carefully rationed black peppercorns, precious cargo from distant India. Even a few grains added to a stew could transform a bland meal into something resembling comfort. Despite the simplicity, you sense camaraderie here. Meals shared under open skies. Stories swapped over modest stews. The distant crackle of campfires forming a kind of brotherhood that no marble villa could replicate. As you step away, the rhythmic clinking of armor fades into the distance. The legions were fed not by grand banquets, but by organization, endurance, and simplicity. They marched on barley and salt pork as much as on discipline and ambition. And so, as the eternal city sleeps and dreams of politics, spectacle, and empire, her legion remains scattered across distant horizons, still hungry, still fed, still very much Roman. The stars wheel slowly overhead, marking your steady steps as you return toward the city's glowing core, where yet more flavors, traditions, and curiosities await. Your steps carry you once again into the heart of Rome. But now you find yourself pulled toward a different kind of meal altogether, one offered not to citizens or soldiers, but to gods. Tonight you've arrived at a temple complex, just as a small religious ceremony is unfolding. The warm glow of oil lamps dances off the marble columns, casting long shadows as priests and attendants prepare their offerings. Incense curls through the air, its sweet resinous smoke mingling with the smells of roasted grains, honey, and fresh herbs. Before the altar sits an array of carefully arranged food offerings, honey cakes, stacked in tidy pyramids, roasted lamb on silver platters, baskets of fruit, glistening under torchlight. The priests, clad in flowing white tunics, chant softly as they present the sacrifices, their voices rising in solemn rhythm. You observe the crowd standing respectfully nearby. Though they are not participants, the onlookers share in the sacred moment, aware that Rome's relationship with the divine was never far removed from the practical business of feeding both gods and men. The honey cakes, or libum, are particularly striking. Small, dense, and rich, they were made of flour cheese and honey, simple ingredients elevated by the act of devotion. The priests drizzle additional honey over the cakes before placing them carefully atop the altar, allowing the syrup to glisten in the lamplight. Historians still debate whether these offerings were consumed entirely by the gods, symbolically of course, or whether priests and temple staff later divided the leftovers among themselves. In most cases, portions of the offerings were burned, while others were likely shared, ensuring nothing went to waste. Beside the altar, a bull stands patiently, its flanks gleaming in the lamplight. Tonight, it will be sacrificed, part of a suobetorilia, one of Rome's most important religious rituals, involving pigs, sheep, and bulls. The meat, once ritually prepared, won't go to waste. After the gods receive their symbolic share, the rest will be cooked and consumed by priest worshippers or even distributed to the poor during festivals. Food here is both sustenance and transaction, a currency offered to maintain favor with the divine forces believed to govern Rome's fate. The gods, after all, needed their share if the city hoped to thrive. As the bull is led forward, the priests recite carefully memorized formulas, ensuring every word is spoken with exact precision. Omens were taken seriously. One misplaced syllable could spoil the ceremony. You glimpse the augurs standing nearby watching the proceedings, their expressions grave as they scan the sky for signs. Historians still argue whether the Romans truly believed the gods cared so deeply for the specifics of ritual, or whether the elaborate ceremonies served more to bind communities together under shared traditions. Likely, both layers of meaning coexisted, reinforcing the city's cohesion. In addition to public sacrifices, countless private rituals unfolded across Rome's households. Shrines dedicated to household gods, the Lares and Penates, held pride of place in kitchens and dining rooms. Families offered bits of bread, drops of wine, or the first slice of a roasted bird to these protectors of heart and home. You imagine a modest family meal, where even the simplest dinner begins, with a whispered prayer and a pinch of flour tossed into the hearth flame. The act may be small, but the intent carries the same weight as the grand offerings you now witness. Further back in the temple courtyard, a group of Vestal virgins tends the sacred flame. Their role, both culinary and symbolic, was vital, keeping the eternal fire burning as a sign of Rome's continuity. Without fire, after all, there is no cooking, no warmth, no survival. You can't help but admire the way Rome wove food into every layer of life, not merely as physical fuel, but as part of its cosmic contract. The empire ate not only to survive, but to honor, to negotiate, to plead for favor. Even festivals revolved around food. During Saturnalia, for instance, public banquets filled the city with free bread, honeyed nuts, roasted pork, and barrels of cheap wine. Slaves and masters swapped roles, dice games filled the streets, and for a brief time, gluttony became ritual itself. Historians still debate whether Saturnalia's wild excesses truly inverted Rome's rigid hierarchies or simply allowed the oppressed a temporary illusion of freedom before the old order resumed. As the ceremony concludes, you watch attendants carefully gather the remaining fruit loaves and meat from the altar. Some will go to the temple staff, some perhaps to the poor who linger at the temple gates, hoping for divine leftovers. Even in worship, Rome's food never truly went to waste. You step back as the crowd disperses, the chants fading into the night air. Somewhere beyond the temple walls, Rome continues to feast. Barter roast, boil, preserve, and always prepare for tomorrow's meals. The eternal city feeds both its gods and its people with the same underlying truth: food at its heart is power. And so you walk on your journey through Rome's forgotten food courts far from finished. As the night stretches further, you drift once again into the busy arteries of Rome's commercial districts, where the wealth of the known world pours into the city and into its markets. You find yourself drawn toward the exotic, the rare, the luxuries that only empire could afford, the imported spices and silks that spiced up Rome's cuisine and revealed its far-reaching grip on global trade. The Horea Bast public warehouses loom before you like sleeping giants. Behind their towering walls, amphorae are stacked in neat, towering rows. Woven sacks are piled carefully sealed with wax, stamped with the marks of distant merchants. Though quiet now, you can still sense the humming energy that fills these storehouses during the day. You step into one smaller warehouse, where spice merchants gather by lamplight sorting the latest arrivals from distant shores. The aroma is overwhelming, sweet, sharp, earthy, and dizzying all at once. Here, tiny cloth bags hold peppercorns, nutmeg cloves, cinnamon, and ginger, each worth their weight in silver. A merchant proudly opens one bag for you, revealing glossy black peppercorns imported all the way from India Malabar to be specific. You pinch a few between your fingers, marveling that something so small traveled thousands of miles along perilous land and sea routes to end up here in a city that cannot seem to eat without seasoning its every dish. Historians still argue how direct Rome's connections to India truly were. Some evidence suggests Roman ships reached Indian ports regularly. Others believe middlemen along the Arabian and Persian coasts handled much of the trade. What remains certain is the staggering value these spices carried. Beyond the pepper stand, crates of cinnamon, or at least what Romans called cinnamon. Some of it likely came from Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, while other shipments were misidentified bark from entirely different trees. Roman writers often debated the true origins of these luxury imports, and unscrupulous traders were more than happy to maintain the mystery to protect their profits. Next to the spice merchants, you find another display silks from the Far East. The delicate threads shimmer even in low lamplight, their colors rich and almost hypnotic. Rome's obsession with silk was so intense that it sparked regular debates in the Senate. Many Roman senators feared that buying silk drained too much gold from the empire while encouraging unmanly luxury. You overhear a merchant boasting that this particular shipment passed through Parthian intermediaries before finally reaching Rome. Though the Romans never conquered China, trade caravans connected the two worlds, blending their economies, even while their armies remained strangers. Further down, you stumble across bundles of saffron threads, vivid orange and impossibly light, carefully weighed and stored like precious gems. Used both as a flavoring and as a dye, saffron was one of the most coveted imports of all, harvested painstakingly by hand from thousands of tiny flowers. Historians still debate the full scale of the saffron trade. While elite kitchens used it to flavor stews and sweetmeats, others believe much of it went into the elaborate cosmetics and perfumes favored by wealthy Roman women. As you continue your walk, you encounter a smaller, even stranger corner of the warehouse. Containers filled with dried dates from Judea, almonds from Persia, pomegranates from Carthage, and even plump dried apricots, a fruit likely introduced through Eastern trade. The variety of flavors available to Rome's wealthiest citizens was staggering. These weren't mere luxury snacks. They served as status symbols on banquet tables, signaling a host's wealth-rich and refined palate. Guests didn't just eat them, they marveled at them, discussed their origins, compared their freshness. In a city obsessed with spectacle, even fruit could be a form of theater. And then there were the resins and gums, myrrh, frankincense, and mastic burned in temples used in perfumes, and sometimes infused into wine or honeyed desserts. The scent of frankincense hangs faintly in the air even now, as if a priest's censer passed here only moments ago. The more you explore, the clearer it becomes. While Rome's poor lived largely on local grains and lentils, the wealthy feasted on the world. Food wasn't simply about sustenance, it was proof of empire. Historians still argue whether Rome's dependency on such far-flung luxuries weakened its economy over time or merely reflected its extraordinary reach. The flow of gold out of Rome certainly concerned more than a few economists even then. You watch as porters begin securing tonight's inventory, stacking crates and rolling amphorae into safe corners for tomorrow's bustling trade. The long lines of commerce that fed Rome's food courts reached not just across cities but across continents, with every shipment representing risk, fortune, and often exploitation. And yet, for now, everything seems stable. The ships still sail. The caravans still arrive. The amphorae still fill. You step back into the cool air of the Roman night, the spice-sweetened breeze following you as you continue your journey through the eternal city's endlessly varied table. You continue your quiet walk, your path now veering toward one of Rome's most visually striking commercial hubs, the great warehouses and shipping centers that once pulsed with the steady rhythm of imported oil, wine, and grain. And at the center of this world stands one humble but indispensable object, the amphora. As you enter the sprawling warehouse district near the Tiber River, the towering stacks of amphorae rise like narrow clay skyscrapers. Each vessel is sealed with wax or resin, its slender neck carefully labeled with stamps or inscriptions detailing its origin, contents, and taxes paid. You pause, marveling at the sheer scale. Thousands upon thousands of these earthen jars, each representing a successful journey across land or sea. The air here is earthy heavy with the scent of wine-soaked clay and olive oil that seep into the warehouse floors over years of use. Workers move through the aisles like ants, carefully shifting amphorae from carts to shelves, recording each transaction on wax tablets that serve as the empire's ancient spreadsheets. You watch one merchant inspecting a fresh shipment of olive oil from North Africa. He wipes a finger along the mouth of an amphora, sniffing carefully before nodding to his assistant. This batch, it seems, has survived its journey intact. No rancid spoilage, no cracks from rough handling. Historians still argue whether amphora design reached perfection out of pure function or accident. Their long, tapered shapes fit tightly into ship holds, maximizing space and stability. When not in transit, they could be embedded upright in sand or racks for safe storage. The system was stunningly efficient. Beyond the oil shipments, rows of wine amphorae await their buyers. Each carries its own subtle distinctions, vintages from Gold Sicily or Greece, some infused with spices, herbs, or even seawater, depending on regional tastes. Wealthier Romans sought out high-end vintages like Falernian or Cacuban, while the working class made do with cheaper, heavily diluted blends sold by volume. You watch as one customer examines a shipment of fish sauce, garum again, delivered from Baetica in Hispania, the warehouse's back corner's house. Enormous stacks of these pungent amphorae, their insides still slightly sticky from earlier spillages. The unmistakable odor clings to the air. Even here, away from the open markets, garum remains the empire's quiet culinary tyrant. At the far edge of the warehouse, you notice another curious detail: broken amphorae, testi, carefully piled in designated disposal pits. The fragments crunch softly underfoot as you wander closer. These discarded shards represent the aftermath of Rome's endless appetite. So many amphorae arrived in the capital that entire artificial hills like Monte Testaccio eventually formed from broken vessel remains. Historians still debate how Rome dealt with the sheer volume of its waste amphorae being among the most visible. Some were repurposed for drainage or insulation, while others simply piled up layer upon layer, silent witnesses to the scale of consumption. Yet not all amphorae carried food. Some bore perfumes, resins, or rare dyes used to tint luxurious fabrics. Others carried grain, particularly from Egypt, Rome's most critical breadbasket. These massive grain amphorae were larger, sturdier, and vital to the city's survival. Without them, the Annona Rome's grain dole would collapse within weeks. As you study one such grain shipment, you realize how vulnerable this system truly was. A single bad harvest along the Nile, a storm, scattering cargo ships, or an outbreak of piracy could send shockwaves through Rome's food supply. The balance was constant and precarious, and yet, for centuries, it worked. The warehouses stayed full. The grain ships kept sailing. Rome's docks remained among the busiest in the known world, their cranes creaking, their porters groaning, their ledgers forever filling with fresh entries. You catch sight of a group of longshoremen sitting near one of the loading docks, eating simple meals of bread, cheese, and pickled fish between unloading shifts. Even here, where the mechanisms of global trade move like clockwork, the daily business of eating is always present. Further down the quay, large, flat-bottomed barges bob gently in the water, awaiting their next load. Slaves and freedmen shuffle cargo along planks, calling out weights and destinations, their voices blending into the eternal hum of commerce. As you step away from the storage yards, the amphorae fade into shadow behind you, but their silent presence lingers, tall, patient guardians of Rome's invisible food machine. Rome's wealth wasn't measured only in gold or marble, but in these humble clay vessels, fragile, countless, and absolutely essential. Your journey continues the endless thread of Rome's forgotten food courts unraveling before your curious feet. The narrow stone alleys begin to grow quieter, but the smells, they never entirely vanish. You breathe deeply as the breeze carries new scents toward you, a mixture of sizzling oil, grilled meats, and if your nose isn't deceiving you, a faint trace of something slightly questionable. As you follow, you arrive at one of Rome's grimmer but very real food realities, the hygiene hazards, lurking beneath all the grand banquets and bustling stalls. You find yourself near a cluster of small, open-air kitchens attached to an insula, where residents prepare late meals on makeshift stoves. Smoke snakes upward into the night sky, but not all of it rises. Much of it hangs low, trapped between tightly packed buildings, mixing with the sour odor of human waste tossed into the gutters earlier that evening. Despite the grandeur Rome projects from its forums and temples, much of the city lives in intimate proximity to its own waste. Chamber pots are emptied out windows into narrow alleys, where shallow channels attempt to carry the runoff into the Tiber. Assuming they aren't blocked, more often than not they are. Historians still argue whether Rome's famous aqueducts and public baths reflected true public hygiene or only benefited the privileged few. While monumental baths dazzled visitors, The average Roman tenant struggled daily with unsanitary cooking spaces, limited fresh water, and air choked with soot. As you watch, one vendor pours oil into a small frying pan balanced over glowing coals. The oil spits violently, sending droplets onto the uneven stone pavement below. He drops small cakes of minced fish and herbs into the pan, flipping them quickly. The sizzling scent is delicious, but you can't help noticing the layer of blackened residue clinging to the pan's surface. Yesterday's meal stubbornly baked into today's. The frying oil itself is reused again and again until it turns thick, smoky, and potentially toxic. The vendor knows his customers are unlikely to complain. When hunger gnaws, standards lower. Next to him, a wine vendor dilutes his latest batch of imported wine with water from a nearby cistern. You glance at the bucket he's using and notice a faint green film floating along the surface. The water system may be one of Rome's engineering marvels, but storage barrels, open cisterns, and rooftop tanks tell a different, less glorious story. Fraud thrives in these conditions. A neighboring vendor offers pure honey that likely contains more boiled-down grape must than actual bee product. Another hawks saffron threads that upon closer inspection are heavily adulterated with dried marigold petals. Even the peppercorns you saw earlier may have been bulked up with dried berries that look similar, but taste like bitter chalk. Historians still debate whether Roman authorities made serious efforts to crack down on these everyday deceptions, or whether officials simply collected their bribes and looked the other way. The aedile city magistrates tasked with market oversight theoretically had authority, but corruption was as endemic as the street filth. You spot a butcher carving up suspicious cuts of meat beneath a flickering torch. The flesh glistens unnaturally under the greasy light. The smell is sharp, slightly metallic, fresh enough to sell, but not fresh enough to reassure. Without refrigeration, meat had to move fast. When it didn't, creative butchers marinated older cuts in vinegar or spiced them heavily to disguise the spoilage. Nearby, an older man hawks buckets of shellfish sitting in briny water. Mussels, clams, tiny eels, all delicate creatures that could turn dangerous overnight. Without ice or reliable cold storage, many street vendors gambled with their customers' digestive tracts daily. And yet, here they are. Customers lined up, coins, ready appetite, overriding caution. Food safety was relative, and the risk of parasites, dysentery, or food poisoning was simply part of Roman life. After all, not everyone could afford the better stalls, located closer to the grand markets where turnover was faster and reputations mattered more. You glance at one customer rubbing his stomach after finishing a meal, his face tightening briefly before he forces a smile. Whether from bad fish, spoiled meat, or tainted water, Rome's citizens lived under a constant cloud of gastrointestinal roulette. Historians still debate just how much lead contamination worsened matters. Rome's extensive plumbing used lead pipes, and while some argue the mineral scale buildup likely protected many citizens, others suspect chronic low-level lead poisoning contributed to public health problems, especially among the upper classes, who consumed more imported wine, often sweetened with lead-based syrup called zappa. Beyond food, you notice other quiet hazards. Flies swarm freely between open drains and uncovered meals. Rats scurry along the shadows, thriving in the refuse of Rome's plenty. Cats patrol the alleys, their green eyes flickering in the lamplight as they stalk smaller vermin. Despite all of this, the food machine never stops. Vendors shout, coins exchange hands, and tomorrow's meals are already being prepared with whatever ingredients remain. The system isn't perfect, but it feeds an empire that has never known a hunger like the one it fears most, mass famine. You step carefully over a slick patch of discarded stew and continue your way through the dim corridors of this paradoxical city where magnificent aqueducts carry fresh water, and yet open sewers run down every street, where emperors dine on flamingo tongues while their citizens bargain for spoiled fish cakes, where ingenuity coexists intimately with constant danger. Rome eats always, but sometimes it pays for its appetite with an upset stomach. The streets thin slightly as you continue your stroll, but you're not done with Rome's edible underworld yet. Tonight, you're about to witness one of the city's most persistent and inventive industries: food scams and marketplace frauds. Because wherever there's profit, there's always someone willing to bend the rules or snap them entirely. You arrive at one of the city's open marketplaces, or Macella, where the late-night vendors are haggling with customers under torchlight. These markets serve as both vital distribution centers and hotbeds for deception. You can hear the pitch of dozens of voices rising into the air like a chaotic symphony of greed, desperation, and humor. A vendor waves at you enthusiastically, offering a basket of glistening red mullet. Fresh from the Tiber this morning, he boasts. You glance at the fish, plump, shining, and oddly rigid. The sharp smell of oversalted water betrays the truth: these fish have likely been dead since yesterday, revived temporarily by a quick dunk in brine to restore their color and firmness. Historians still argue whether the average Roman shopper truly believed these kinds of claims or simply played along pretending not to notice as long as the price stayed low. The charade was often mutually understood. Trust was expensive, but everyone needed to eat. Next to the fishmonger, a wine merchant peddles jugs of his finest Falernian vintage. The wine inside, however, is cheap provincial stock, watered down and darkened with boiled grape must to simulate age and richness. A quick swirl in the cup releases its overly sweet aroma, a dead giveaway for trained noses. But most buyers here lack that luxury. Further down, another vendor offers saffron threads, or so he claims. You watch him skillfully mix genuine saffron with strands of marigold petals and even thin strips of dried carrot, stretching his expensive inventory like a baker, adding sawdust to flour. The color looks convincing enough under low light. Most customers will never know. Fraud wasn't always limited to raw ingredients. Olive oil vendors frequently mixed low-grade oils with dregs from previous pressings. Some even blended oil with rendered animal fat or thickened it artificially with starches to give the illusion of premium quality. The subtle cloudiness revealed under lamplight, if you know what to look for, tells you all you need to know. Historians still debate how seriously the Roman state attempted to police this fraudulent behavior. Aediles charged with overseeing public markets theoretically had authority to fine and punish dishonest vendors. But bribery was rampant, and many inspectors simply took a share of the profit in exchange for looking the other way. You pause near a butcher carving lamb cuts with a heavy iron blade. The meat looks fresh, but you've already seen too much tonight to trust appearances. In some corners of Rome, unscrupulous butchers mix dog, goat, and even donkey meat into their offerings, especially when supplying cheap sausages or ground patties where the customer couldn't easily tell the difference. The smell of roasting fills the air as one sausage vendor grills skewers over an open flame. The aroma is heavenly heavy with garlic, pepper, and fennel seed. But what exactly is inside those casings remains an eternal mystery, best left unexamined. Even bread Rome's sacred daily staple was not immune. Some bakers illegally mixed flour with sand chalk or crushed beans to stretch their supply, producing loaves that wore down teeth and filled bellies without properly nourishing them. In a city obsessed with its grain supply, this kind of tampering could provoke serious consequences, but only if discovered. You pass a group of frustrated housewives, bartering aggressively with a fruit vendor, his plums displayed in neat piles, hide bruised and rotting specimens tucked beneath the top layer. One customer lifts a few and snorts in disgust before storming off. The vendor simply shrugs and rearranges his display for the next buyer. Fraud wasn't purely the domain of street-level cheats. Some large-scale merchants bribed shipping inspectors to mislabel goods, allowing spoiled grain or diluted wine to enter Rome's massive storage facilities under full state protection. Scandals occasionally erupted, but most offenses faded quietly into bureaucratic paperwork. As you walk deeper into the marketplace, you realize how deeply fraud and survival intertwine. The average vendor isn't malicious so much as desperate fighting to survive in a city that demands so much and offers so few safety nets for failure. And despite it all, customers still flock to the market. They bargain, they haggle, they taste samples cautiously, and they navigate this web of half-truths with the weary expertise of people who have seen it all before. Fraud may flourish, but so does sharp-eyed skepticism. Historians still argue whether these daily deceptions fatally weakened Rome's economy over time or merely reflected its ability to adapt and improvise. In truth, perhaps both were true, an empire of staggering wealth constantly undermined by thousands of tiny invisible cuts. You leave the marketplace behind as vendors pack up their remaining goods, preparing for tomorrow's games of chance. Somewhere behind you, a child's voice calls out a final desperate sales pitch before the torches are doused. Rome's food system isn't just about abundance. It's about cunning negotiation and knowing when to close one eye and open the other a little wider. And so you move forward again, the dark streets guiding you toward yet another layer of Rome's endlessly complex appetite. The streets take on a quieter rhythm now, the night reaching that deep reflective hour when only certain quarters of Rome still buzz with activity. And tonight your steps carry you into one such corner, the Jewish quarter nestled along the Tiber's bend, where Rome's diverse food story takes yet another turn. You slip beneath a modest stone arch and into winding streets filled with the soft murmur of Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, blending into one another. Oil lamps flicker in doorways. The aroma here is different from the rest of the city, familiar yet distinct. Bread still bakes stews, still simmer, but the ingredients, methods, and especially the rules behind these meals reveal another world entirely. You approach a small courtyard where families gather for their late meal. The dishes spread before them are simple but deeply intentional. Bowls of lentil stew, plates of pickled vegetables, roasted fish, flatbreads, brushed lightly with olive oil, all prepared under the strict guidance of kashrut Jewish dietary law. Unlike the majority of Rome's citizens, the Jewish community here adheres to rules that forbid pork, shellfish, certain fats, and the mixing of dairy and meat. This has shaped an entire cuisine that feels at once rooted in Roman ingredients, yet profoundly different in execution. Historians still debate how strictly these dietary laws were enforced among Rome's Jewish population. Some evidence points to communities deeply committed to preserving their identity through food. Others suggest occasional compromises made for survival under imperial pressures. You watch as a woman carefully checks the fish laid out before her, inspecting the scales and fins to ensure they meet kosher standards. Unlike the questionable eels and shellfish sold elsewhere in Rome, these fish are chosen with meticulous care. The fishmonger who supplies them has earned generations of trust. Nearby, an elderly man tends to a pot of cholent, a slow-cooked stew of beans grains and beef brisket designed to cook through the Sabbath without violating the prohibition on kindling fire during the holy day. The aroma is rich and comforting, layered with onions, garlic, and warming spices. The community's bakers are equally careful. You pass one such bakery, where round loaves of unleavened flatbread cool on wooden racks. During Passover, the entire bakery would be scrubbed down and purged of leaven, honoring the memory of hurried ancestors fleeing Egypt. You catch snippets of conversation as neighbors discuss tomorrow's market orders, which vendors can be trusted, who carries acceptable olive oil, which wine merchants understand the rules of ritual purity. Trust and reputation are more precious here than any Roman coin. Historians still argue whether the imperial authorities allowed these communities full freedom to maintain their customs or merely tolerated them under close watch. While periodic tensions erupted, many Jewish neighborhoods thrived quietly for generations, creating vibrant microcosms within the empire's broader chaos. You note the absence of many Roman indulgences, no sausages, no garum, no exotic dormice or flamboyant peacock platters. Yet, what emerges instead is a cuisine built on resilience, stretching legumes, preserving vegetables, flavoring meals with herbs, honey, and judiciously rationed spices. Every meal carries a thread connecting past to present. Children run past, giggling as they carry small baskets of dried dates and almonds, common Sabbath treats. A mother calls after them softly, reminding them to avoid the gutters. Even in this quieter quarter, Rome's notorious sanitation challenges remain unchanged. A few steps further brings you to a butcher shop, preparing kosher meat. The butcher's blade glints in the lamplight as he performs shachita, a ritual slaughter designed to minimize the animal's suffering while ensuring proper drainage of blood, which is prohibited for consumption. The process is precise, reverent, a far cry from the hurried butchery you witnessed earlier near the Macella. You glance at the clean work table, the absence of flies, the careful segregation of tools for different meats. This is food as spiritual discipline, not merely fuel, but a constant reaffirmation of identity. Even the local wine merchants operate under special agreements, supplying kosher wine for festivals and religious ceremonies, careful to follow protocols about who may handle the grapes, press the juice, and store the amphorae. Despite their separateness, the Jewish quarter is still tightly bound to Rome's vast trade network. Olive oil from Judea, dates from Jericho, pomegranates from the Nile. All move through the same shipping routes that supply Rome's elite. But they land here for different purposes and different palates. Historians still debate whether Rome's Jewish cuisine directly influenced broader Roman food culture, or whether the two worlds largely ran parallel. Some suggest that preserved fruits, certain methods of pickling, and specific seasoning techniques quietly migrated into Roman kitchens over generations. As you stand in the cool evening air, the quiet resilience of this community hums all around you. They have adapted to Rome's bounty without losing themselves to its indulgences, preserving traditions born under desert skies, but practiced now beneath Roman domes. A young boy offers you a piece of honey-dipped date cake, shy but proud. You accept with a small nod and taste sweet, rich, earthy. A simple reminder that even under foreign rule flavor can carry memory. The stars overhead shimmer above the city's silent sprawl. Somewhere nearby, Rome's grand banquets continue. Its fast food stalls close for the night and its markets prepare for dawn. But here in this small corner of the empire, faith still sits at the dinner table, and you move onward again, drawn deeper into the endless tangled banquet that is Rome's forgotten food courts. The streets open slightly as you wander farther from the cozy lanes of the Jewish quarter, and now you find yourself pulled toward another layer of Rome's culinary complexity, the lifeline of Egypt. You're walking alongside the Tiber once more, but this time the river whispers not just of local trade, but of massive grain fleets that connect Rome to its most important overseas supplier. The Egyptian grain ships known as navis frumentaria were the beating heart of Rome's food security. Without them, the city's population over 1 million strong would collapse into chaos within weeks. As you approach the docks, you can almost hear the creaking of thick wooden hulls as they unload sack after sack of precious wheat, the cargo, glinting pale gold in the moonlight. Historians still argue whether Rome's dependency on Egypt was a stroke of brilliant imperial logistics or a dangerous over-centralization of its food system. What's clear is this: the fertile floodplains of the Nile fed not just Alexandria, but the insatiable mouth of the capital itself. Tonight, a few smaller Egyptian vessels are moored at the quay, their crews unloading both grain and more exotic goods for the wealthier tables of Rome. You spot amphorae, marked with the distinctive red paint of Alexandria, each one carefully catalogued by customs officials as scribes sit nearby with wax tablets recording every amphora as if it were a piece of treasure. But the grain isn't the only culinary gift Egypt sends northward. You follow your nose and catch the familiar oddly sweet scent of Nile fish to Oxyrhynchus, dried and salted for shipment. Though few Roman elites would clamor for dried fish, the lower classes and soldiers relied on it as a cheap, durable protein. A merchant nearby unwraps a bundle of papyrus baskets, revealing pickled radishes, preserved lemons and jars of date syrup thick and dark like liquid amber. These imports fill a niche, somewhere between daily sustenance and luxury, their flavors foreign, but slowly seeping into Rome's kitchen experiments. You step aside as a line of porters carries crates containing the unmistakable bundles of papyrus scrolls. Rome didn't just consume Egypt's wheat, it absorbed its knowledge too. The flow of Egyptian medical texts, astronomical records, and culinary methods found eager audiences in Rome's more scholarly circles. As you move past the grain warehouses, you overhear dock workers joking about the Praefectus Annonae, Rome's official in charge of grain distribution. His job may seem thankless, but his power rivals senators. A misstep in managing the grain dole could topple entire administrations. The stakes, like the granaries themselves, were always monumental. Historians still debate whether Egyptian farmers benefited from or suffered under Rome's grain demands. Some argue that imperial control brought stability and markets for surplus. Others insist that local populations bore crushing tax burdens to keep Rome's warehouses full. The moonlight reflects gently off another section of the quay, where traders have gathered around crates filled not with grain but with delicacies for wealthier Roman tables. These include jars of honeyed lotus roots, amphorae, of spiced Nile wine, and bundles of dried figs wrapped in woven reeds. You marvel at how far Egyptian culinary influence reached into Roman society. The elite dined on imported Nile perch baked in honey glaze. They experimented with lentil stews, thickened by recipes originating from Alexandria's Greek-Egyptian chefs. Even the cult of Isis, popular among Romans seeking mystical religious experiences, influenced exotic banquet rituals, with offerings of Egyptian fruits, fish, and sweet cakes made of barley and honey. Further along, you see small shrines dotting the dockside corners dedicated not to Jupiter or Mars, but to Isis and Serapis. Their presence is a reminder that Egypt's cultural reach wasn't limited to food. Spiritual imports traveled alongside culinary ones, subtly reshaping parts of Rome's identity. You pause near a grain barge, its deck, covered in tarps and sleeping crew members. The enormity of the operation sinks in. Each ship carries enough grain to feed tens of thousands. Multiply that by an entire fleet arriving every year, and you begin to see how Rome could grow so vast and yet remain so frighteningly dependent. One poorly timed Nile flood, one stretch of bad weather across the Mediterranean, and Rome would teeter on the brink of starvation. The emperor understood this all too well, hence the personal oversight given to grain fleets and the elaborate harbor infrastructures built to receive them. As you step away, you glance back at the rhythmic, almost meditative scene of porters unloading, scribes recording, and merchants haggling. Egypt's rich earth flows into Rome, not as tribute but as lifeblood, quietly, constantly, and absolutely essential. The eternal city, so proud in its marble grandeur, is in many ways a fragile stomach resting on foreign soil. And with that sobering thought, you continue walking. The threads that tie Rome's forgotten food courts together grow thicker, more tangled, and far from finished. The gentle lapping of the Tiber fades behind you as your path now curves south, where you encounter yet another vital artery. In Rome's food web, North Africa's olive oil empire. If Egyptian grain filled the bellies of Rome, North African olive oil slicked nearly everything that passed across Roman tongues. You find yourself standing before another warehouse district, this one dominated by towering stacks of globular clay. Dresseled 20 amphorae. Fat-bellied, wide-shouldered, stamped and marked with shipping details from Provincia Africa Proconsularis. The air is heavy with the faint, earthy aroma of olive oil, nutty, faintly fruity, and absolutely everywhere. Historians still argue whether North Africa's rise as Rome's primary oil supplier was a deliberate state policy or a natural evolution of market forces. Either way, by the height of the empire, North Africa had become Rome's most crucial source for this liquid gold. Porters worked by torchlight, even at this late hour, rolling amphorae across flat wooden sledges, careful not to crack the fragile clay. The oil inside is destined for nearly every corner of Roman society, from kitchens and bakeries to bathhouses and lampstands. You pause beside a merchant who inspects one freshly delivered amphora, breaking its seal, and dipping a flat wooden spoon into the golden surface. He sniffs, tastes, and nods in satisfaction, before scribbling a quick mark onto a tally slate. This batch at least is pure. Fraud lurked here too, of course. Some unscrupulous traders cut inferior oil with cheaper nut oils, or sold reused oil from bathhouses as culinary grade, a practice that earned the city scorn and severe penalties when discovered. Historians still debate how strictly these oil quality regulations were enforced, but Rome's reliance on pure olive oil for both food and ritual made its quality a matter of pride. Impure oil offended not only palates, but the gods themselves. You glance around at the sheer quantity stockpiled here. Olive oil wasn't a condiment in Rome, it was currency. It lubricated not only the bodies of bathers and the loaves of bakers, but also the gears of state taxation and military supply chains. Rome's dependence on North African oil grew so absolute that some scholars refer to it as an invisible monopoly. Vast estates, many owned by senators or the imperial family, turned the provinces of Tripolitania and Bisactina into what we might now call agribusiness empires. Tens of thousands of laborers, tenant farmers, and slaves worked year-round to keep the oil flowing. You follow a smaller side path that leads toward the processing area, where rows of enormous stone presses stand idle under the moonlight. During harvest season, olives would be ground under massive millstones, turned by donkeys or slaves. The pulp would then be layered in woven mats and squeezed under immense wooden beams, dripping oil into large collection basins. The oil was graded carefully. The first cold press, Oleum ex albis olivis, was the most prized for dining tables. Subsequent more heavily pressed batches were used for cooking, lighting, or industrial purposes. Even now, after so many centuries, traces of this oil empire remain. Archaeological digs across North Africa reveal miles of crumbling aqueducts, ruined oil presses, abandoned warehouses, and entire port towns that once existed solely to move oil across the empire. You pause as two merchants argue quietly near a ledger stand. They speak of quotas, taxes, and upcoming shipments, delayed by weather off the Sicilian coast. You can hear the tension in their voices. The entire system, balanced precariously on timely arrivals and predictable harvests. Historians still argue whether the empire's obsession with centralizing such essential supplies sowed the seeds of its own eventual collapse. By concentrating so much reliance on distant regions, Rome left itself dangerously exposed to regional instability. And yet, for centuries, it worked marvelously so. Rome's poorest citizens received government-subsidized oil through public distributions. Bakers greased their ovens. Bathers oiled their skin. Lanterns flickered through every insula and domus. And at the top, the imperial estates grew ever more profitable, their vast warehouses filling faster than amphora makers could produce enough vessels to contain them. You step away from the oil yard and glance back at the amphora stacks, standing like silent sentinels under the pale moon. They represent both Rome's genius and its fragility, a system astonishing in its scale, but vulnerable to every ripple across its vast dominion. Beyond these amphorae, Rome's appetite still roars, and your walk through its tangled food courts presses forward deeper into the belly of an empire that never truly stops feeding itself. The streets narrow once more as you wander toward the market gardens tucked along Rome's outskirts. But tonight, something unusual clings to the air, a restless mood. The night sky churns with scattered clouds, and somewhere distant you hear the low rumble of thunder. It reminds you that even Rome, the eternal city, bows before the whims of nature. Tonight you enter a different conversation entirely, the quiet but growing impact of climate shifts on Rome's food supply. Unlike the more visible gears of trade and politics, these changes creep slowly like water seeping beneath foundations. You pass small farming plots, where slaves and tenant farmers harvest late crops by torchlight. Rows of barley, wheat, and legumes grow in tightly managed fields. their roots drinking from aqueduct-fed irrigation channels. But this year, you hear whispers that the yield has been thin. The rains were late. The Nile's flood was weak. Historians still debate how much Rome's food supply was affected by gradual climate fluctuations, what some now call the Roman climate optimum, a period of unusual stability that allowed the empire to flourish. But as that stability began to falter, the smallest disruptions could ripple across the food system. A farmer greets you near his small villa. His face is drawn with worry as he inspects his olive trees, which suffered under an unseasonably dry spring. The blooms came too early, he says quietly, and the winds stripped them before the bees could visit. His words are simple, but they carry centuries of hard-earned knowledge. Further along, you encounter grain merchants discussing delayed Egyptian shipments. The annual flood of the Nile, so reliable for so long, has been growing erratic. Too little water starves the fields. Too much washes away entire harvests. Both scenarios starve Rome. You overhear a baker grumbling near a public oven, his flour sacks lighter than usual. The price will rise again, he mutters to no one in particular. The poor will riot and the Senate will scramble to buy more grain they cannot afford. Historians still argue whether such early climate instability directly accelerated Rome's decline or merely exposed its brittle over-reliance on distant harvests. Either way, you sense how easily an empire's grandeur can unravel when its soil falters. The vineyards also feel nature's fickleness. You pass rows of trellised grapevines, their clusters smaller than years prior. A vintner carefully inspects the grapes, aware that a poor harvest means weaker wine and lower profits. We used to export to Gaul, he sighs. Now we struggle to fill our own amphorae. Even the mighty fisheries strain. Coastal fishermen unload meager catches at the riverside markets. Changing water temperatures, unpredictable storms, and overfishing strain their nets. The once abundant supplies of mackerel and sardines thin out, forcing many to turn inland for protein, where the pressure on livestock grows in response. You pause at a public granary near the Thermopolium. Guards stand watch as citizens queue for rations, whispering rumors, fewer ships arriving, more grain being bought up by speculators. Politicians debating whether to reduce the monthly dole to stretch supplies. Rome's administrators understood the stakes. The grain dole was not merely generosity, it was a tool to keep civil unrest at bay. Bread controlled the city as much as legions defended it. If the food chain faltered, so too would the empire's control. You pass several scholars huddled beneath an archway, their conversation laced with concern. They speak of colder winters, creeping down from the north of wetter summers, drowning Gallic harvests of strange cloud patterns unfamiliar even to seasoned astrologers. Historians still debate whether these early warnings foreshadowed the more dramatic climate shifts that would plague the centuries ahead, the so-called late antique Little Ice Age. But already the balance is tilting. You walk by a wealthy villa where the difference between rich and poor is on full display. Inside, servants prepare a feast, using preserved stocks, pickled fruits, imported spices, amphorae of last season's olive oil. For the wealthy, nature's hiccups can be buffered by coin and storage. For the poor, there is only the thin porridge and watery wine left behind. And yet, Rome remains Rome. The markets open each morning. The ships still arrive, though fewer perhaps. The ovens still glow, the amphorae still flow, and the city's appetite presses forward, pretending its stability is eternal. You pause as another low rumble of thunder echoes through the hills. A light drizzle begins to fall soft, barely more than mist. The farmers welcome it, though many know it will not be enough. The empire feeds itself tonight as it has for centuries, but you feel the tremor beneath its foundations. The food courts like Rome itself live in a delicate balance, always full, always fragile. And you continue your journey forward, following the uncertain trail that winds deeper into the city's complicated hunger. The light rain fades as you move deeper into the city's heart, but the sense of vulnerability lingers, clinging to the streets like a thin film. Now you enter a darker chapter of Rome's food story. The times when the carefully balanced system didn't just strain but broke. Tonight you walk through the shadow of famines and plagues, Rome's ultimate food nightmares. You find yourself passing the Horea Publica, the grand public granaries that normally hold the empire's security stockpiles. But tonight the cavernous warehouses stand disturbingly quiet. The great wooden doors creak softly in the wind, the usual parade of porters and carts noticeably absent. The grain reserves have run thin. Historians still argue about how often Rome faced true famine. Some suggest that complete starvation was rare. Others point to regional shortages and urban riots as recurring features of imperial life. But when multiple failures aligned poor Nile floods, piracy on the seas, political turmoil, or simple logistical failures, the consequences could become terrifyingly real. You see citizens gathered in small crowds, whispering and glancing nervously toward the granaries. Rumors rippled through the population, a shipment lost at sea, a delayed harvest in Africa, a warehouse fire that destroyed an entire season's supply. Children's voices carry softly in the air as families share increasingly meager meals. A woman tears a small loaf into precise portions for her children. There is no butter, no cheese, no fruit to accompany it tonight. Just dry bread and thin, bitter wine. You overhear an elderly man speaking to his neighbor in a low voice. "In my father's time," he says, "we saw the bread riots. The people stormed the granaries when the shipments didn't come. The Senate gave out what little they had. It was not enough." Historians still debate whether these bread riots threatened true revolution or remained isolated, desperate flashes. But the fear they inspired was real. The grain dole was not simply welfare. It was a carefully calculated release valve on a city always teetering on the edge of hunger. The streets grow quieter as you move toward one of the city's major public bakeries. The enormous ovens stand cold tonight, a rare and unsettling sight. The ration lines have been suspended until more grain arrives. You see a small crowd gathered at a vendor's stall. He offers boiled vegetables, thin, barley porridge, and a few handfuls of dried figs, scraping together what can still be found. Prices have tripled, but those with coins still pay. The poor beg or barter what little they have left. In times like these, the black markets thrive. You glimpse shadowy figures exchanging sacks in alleyways, hoarded grain, private stockpiles, or perhaps stolen reserves sold for criminal profit. For some, Rome's hunger is merely another business opportunity. You approach a quiet shrine where an anxious mother lights a small oil lamp, whispering prayers to Ceres, goddess of grain. Rome's temples filled quickly during these times. As the people begged for the stability they could no longer count on from their officials or merchants. And then there is the specter that often arrived alongside famine disease. Malnutrition weakens the body, making it fertile ground for sickness. Dysentery spreads easily through Rome's already precarious sanitation systems. Parasites flourish as desperate citizens eat spoiled or tainted food. Historians still argue whether these food shortages directly contributed to Rome's most devastating plagues or simply exacerbated their effects. But once the cycle begins, hunger feeding disease feeding fear, the city's vast population becomes its own worst vulnerability. You walk past a makeshift infirmary where the sick lay on wooden cots. Their thin frames and sunken cheeks tell the story more plainly than any record. Fevered whispers fill the air. No bread, no oil, no garum. The city's leaders scramble for solutions: emergency shipments, grain subsidies, temporary price freezes. But their options narrow with each failed harvest and lost ship. Rome's brilliance as a global consumer makes it dangerously dependent on smooth global trade. Further along, you pass an official notice nailed to a wooden post. The edict announces temporary restrictions on private grain purchases, warning against hoarding, forbidding merchants from stockpiling for profit. Whether the order will be enforced or simply ignored with a well-placed bribe remains uncertain. Historians still debate whether the Roman state truly had the administrative strength to handle repeated food crises or whether it merely patched cracks until larger forces overtook it. As you pause near a fountain, you notice two children dipping their hands into the water to scoop up what few crumbs of softened bread someone left behind. The image sticks with you, the wealthiest empire in the world reduced in these fragile moments to quiet desperation. And yet, Rome endures. The markets will reopen. The ships may still arrive. The farmers may yet deliver the next harvest. But as you continue walking, you understand that Rome's food courts were never as permanent as they appeared. They lived at the mercy of rivers' winds and fragile supply lines, stretching across 3 continents. The eternal city survives, but tonight its stomach growls. You continue your walk, but now the air carries not just hunger but dread. Rome's food crises didn't always arrive slowly like a failing harvest or a sluggish fleet. Sometimes catastrophe descended in a single brutal wave. And so tonight you step into one of Rome's darkest hours, the Antonine Plague. It begins quietly, as plagues often do. A few soldiers returning from campaigns in the east carry something unseen in their breath, their sweat, their blood. Within weeks, Rome's streets whisper of fevers, rashes, and sudden deaths. And with the dying come empty markets. You walk past shuttered stalls where baskets once heavy with produce now sit abandoned. Fruit rots in place, flies buzzing lazily under flickering torches. Vendors once full of sharp sales pitches and eager negotiations have vanished. Some fled to the countryside. Others lie sick behind closed doors. Historians still debate the exact nature of the Antonine Plague, whether it was smallpox, measles, or something entirely different. What is certain is the scale of its devastation. Hundreds of thousands dead across the empire, perhaps millions. The markets are hollow. The food chains, already delicate, begin to snap. You approach a bakery where normally the sweet smell of fresh bread would fill the air. Tonight, only the cold metallic tang of empty ovens greets you. The baker's apprentice, pale and coughing, sweeps dust from the entrance with slow, deliberate strokes. He glances up at you briefly, eyes sunken and afraid. At the nearby Horea, guards stand watch not to manage crowds, but to prevent looting. The grain stores are sealed, rationed carefully by imperial decree. Supplies still exist, but fewer hands remain to grind the flour, knead the dough, or bake the loaves. Labor shortages turn even abundant grain into scarcity. The sick gather in public porticos and temple courtyards, hoping for divine mercy. The temple of Asclepius, god of healing, swells with desperate citizens offering sacrifices of bread, oil, and honey. Incense burns constantly. The air is thick with smoke and quiet sobs. Even the emperors are not spared. You overhear citizens discussing how Marcus Aurelius himself mourns the loss of his co-emperor Lucius Verus. The plague respects neither status nor rank. Historians still argue whether the Antonine Plague directly crippled Rome's economy or whether the empire's bureaucracy absorbed its blows more effectively than we imagine. But the streets before you tonight suggest a system struggling under immense strain. You pass a fishmonger's stall, his last catch spoiling on wooden planks. With fewer sailors, fewer shipments arrive from distant coasts. Pickled fish stocks dwindle. The price of salt rises. What food remains becomes harder to preserve. You spot a group of citizens sharing a simple meal on the temple steps. Flatbread soaked in watered wine, a single dish of lentils, stretched thin between them. Conversation is hushed eyes, darting to every cough that echoes nearby. Merchants argue quietly over prices for dwindling spice stocks. Without labor to manage ships and caravans, luxuries like pepper, saffron, and cinnamon become even more rare, hoarded by those wealthy enough to outbid the desperate. You pass by a closed popina, where the owner has scrawled a sign on the door, "By the gods return when the air is clean." Whether he closed to escape disease or because customers stopped coming, it hardly matters. Business has died alongside the city's appetite. Historians still debate whether such plagues weaken Rome's military, might drain its tax base, or simply exposed vulnerabilities already present in its sprawling systems. But the emptiness of these streets speaks louder than any scroll. You glimpse one priest sacrificing a lamb at a roadside shrine, his voice trembling as he prays for the return of order, for the grain ships to dock safely, for the bread lines to shorten, for the city to breathe freely once more. And yet, amid the grief and ruin, Rome still refuses to stop. Somewhere, ships still sail. Farmers still plant. Bakers still rise before dawn if they live. The imperial system groans, but it holds for now. You continue walking, each step echoing through Rome's hallowed night. This plague is but one of many tests Rome will face. The Eternal City is many things magnificent, brutal, indulgent, but most of all, it is stubborn. The food courts may grow quiet, but their skeletons remain waiting for life to return. Rome survives. It always does. But you know, as the city itself surely knows that each recovery becomes harder than the last. And still, your journey presses forward into the city's next struggle, its next meal, its next uncertain breath. The streets remain eerily thin with bodies as you move onward, but something else fills the emptiness, now a strange, hollow stillness. It is the sound of collapse approaching. Tonight, you walk the pathways of Rome's vanishing food courts, witnessing what happens as the mechanisms that fed millions begin to crack, stall, and quietly fail. You arrive at what was once one of the great Macella, the open-air markets that once bustled with shouting vendors, spinning coin purses and the clatter of amphorae. But here, under the pale torchlight, most stalls sit empty. A few desperate merchants remain their tables sparse, their voices subdued. You pause near a fish vendor, whose offerings are limited to a few baskets of salted anchovies and two sad-looking eels, barely moving in their basin. Once fleets of fishing boats delivered daily catches. Now, with fewer sailors and shrinking trade routes, even the rivers seem thinner. Historians still argue whether these empty stalls were caused primarily by economic failure, shrinking population, or increasing political instability. Likely, they all arrived together as the support beams collapsed one by one under the weight of an overstretched empire. The olive oil sellers nearby huddle around tiny flames their amphorae, fewer in number their clay surfaces already bearing reuse marks. Even North Africa's once bountiful oil estates falter now as civil wars invasions, and declining labor forces erode productivity. The steady river of oil like the grain from Egypt no longer flows freely. You notice bread vendors standing with unsold loaves, their faces tight. The state can no longer consistently subsidize the grain dole. Fewer ships reach Ostia. Fewer taxes fund imports. The annona, once Rome's proudest achievement, becomes a patchwork of irregular shipments, desperate improvisations, and increasingly tense promises. A magistrate posts a new decree on a marble column, nearby temporary ration cuts, new price freezes, warnings against hoarding. His face is calm, his writing authoritative, but you see the exhaustion in his eyes. These announcements have grown more frequent and less effective. Historians still debate whether the decline of Rome's urban markets was more social or structural. Some blame failing bureaucracy. Others point to the weakening military that once guaranteed secure trade. But as you watch a crowd of hungry citizens whisper bitterly under the posted edict, it's clear that trust in the system has begun to unravel. You move toward a once prosperous Popina. Its stone counter cracked its dolia, those large embedded jars empty and gathering dust. No stews bubble, no wine is poured. The fast food culture that once fed workers, travelers, and laborers has thinned to a handful of desperate survivors. Even Rome's famed Thermopolia, once thriving with sizzling sausages and cheap fish soups, now operates sporadically. Many shut permanently, their former owners swallowed by poverty or plague. The Thermopolia had been Rome's safety net for the kitchenless poor. With them vanishing, so too does an essential layer of daily life. You overhear a merchant arguing with a butcher about spoiled meat. Supplies arrive late now. Storage is unreliable. Prices rise and tempers follow. Both men lower their voices when guards pass nearby. The mood is tense. Everyone knows theft and violence surge. When food becomes unstable, further along you stumble across a public granary, partially shuttered. Rats dart between its stone foundation blocks. Even Rome's mighty Horea, once models of logistical genius, feel brittle now. Mold creeps into old grain reserves. Without constant maintenance, even stone can decay. The poor suffer most, but even the wealthy feel the pinch. You pass a noble villa, where crates of imported delicacies sit half-filled. The house steward explains to a frustrated mistress that no saffron arrived this year, that the pepper supply has thinned, that the honey merchants have doubled their prices. The elite grumble, but their pantries remain fuller than the streets. Historians still debate whether Rome's food shortages during this period were absolute scarcity or redistribution failure. Likely both. The system was designed for stability at its height, but it was never built for sustained contraction. Even the temples feel the weight of hunger now. You pass a shrine where meager offerings lie, smaller loaves, bruised fruit, thinner streams of wine poured as libation. The gods receive less, not from neglect, but from exhaustion. And yet, despite the hollowing, some parts of Rome's food world resist, collapse entirely. Small garden plots sprout behind insulae, where citizens grow herbs, beans, and onions. Goats bleat softly in alley pens. Chickens scratch for fallen grains. The most resilient citizens find ways to survive through backyard subsistence. You notice one family bartering bundles of dried figs and salted olives with neighbors in exchange for eggs. These microeconomies, small, flexible face-to-face, quietly replace parts of the massive food court system that once fed the city through imperial scale. The rain starts again, lightly tapping across roof tiles and stone walls. You tilt your head and let it cool your face as Rome's fragile rhythm continues beneath your feet. The markets may grow quieter. The amphorae may arrive more rarely. The temples may burn fewer incense offerings. But even in decline, Rome breathes. It adjusts. It clings. The food courts fade not all at once, but piece by piece. And you keep walking, following the slow, unraveling threads of a banquet that once spanned the world. The rain lightens as you walk further into the city, but a new tension lingers in the air, heavier than hunger, darker than scarcity. You're approaching the era when food wasn't just scarce, it was weaponized. Tonight you step into the days of barbarian sieges, when Rome itself for the first time in centuries felt starvation press against its very walls. You arrive near the ancient Servian Wall, once a relic of a more primitive Rome, but now desperately relevant again. Beyond these crumbling stones, waves of invading tribes press closer, Visigoths, Vandals, and others who've learned Rome's weaknesses better than many Romans cared to admit. Historians still debate whether the sieges were the final blow or merely one symptom of Rome's long unraveling. But when the city found itself trapped behind its own walls, its food courts collapsed almost overnight. You walk through a market square that once overflowed with vendors and shouting customers. Now it sits nearly silent. A few gaunt figures huddle around small fires, sharing thin soups made from whatever scraps remain, wilted greens, bits of dry bread softened with water, even boiled leather strips torn from sandals. You hear one man muttering bitterly, "Better to eat the shoes than starve." His companion doesn't laugh. With supply lines severed, Rome's enormous food machine sputters. Grain fleets no longer arrive. The great storage warehouses sit empty or sealed, their reserves spent. The grain dole is suspended indefinitely. The Senate debates in circles while stomachs growl. You pause near a butcher's abandoned stall. The knives still hang on their hooks, but no meat remains. Citizens glance furtively at stray dogs and pigeons eyeing them, not as animals but as potential meals. Hunger makes predators of the desperate. Historians still argue how deep cannibalism reached during these sieges. Some sources whisper of families feeding on the dead. Others dismiss such tales as exaggerations, meant to dramatize Rome's humiliation. But you feel standing here now how fragile civility becomes when hunger tightens its grip. Nearby, you spot a once prosperous baker's home, now gutted and dark. The massive communal ovens stand cold, once symbols of Rome's daily routine. These ovens are now just hollow mouths echoing the emptiness around them. Children cry softly as mothers rock them with empty hands. A few gnaw on dried reeds or old fig pits, simply to quiet their aching jaws. The rich, having hoarded what stores they could, retreat into their villas under guard, while outside their gates commoners beg or bargain. At a fountain, you see people trading anything of value for food jewelry, for a handful of beans, fine wool for a scrap of cheese. The coinage of Rome means little now. Barter and favors rule. You overhear rumors swirling that the barbarians might offer food if the Senate agrees to pay ransom, that some citizens consider slipping outside the walls to scavenge fields left abandoned. Few return from such ventures. The city's temples fill again, not with sacrifice but with desperate prayer. Citizens kneel before statues of Ceres, Jupiter, and Vesta, whispering pleas that grow more desperate each passing day. But the gods, it seems, have gone silent. Historians still debate how the population coped psychologically with this inversion of their world, the eternal city reduced to begging its enemies for mercy, its citizens bargaining their wealth for lentils and moldy bread. A gust of wind carries the bitter smoke of burning fields. Just beyond the walls, crops torched by invaders, to further choke the city into submission. Starvation becomes a weapon sharpened more keenly than any sword. And yet, amid the despair, fragments of resourcefulness remain. You pass a rooftop where a family tends to small herb gardens. Parsley, onions, dill, anything to stretch bland porridges. Others collect rainwater in clay pots, catching every drop like treasure. The resilience you've seen throughout Rome's food system lingers here too, even in collapse. People barter scraps, boil old bones for broth, invent new recipes out of desperation. Bitter acorn bread, wild grass, soups, stews, thickened with ground beans. But you can feel that even this resourcefulness has limits. Hunger gnaws at Rome's final defenses from within. The marketplaces that once symbolized imperial might now become shadows of failure. As you move toward the Forum, the grandeur of marble columns and carved facades feel surreal, almost mocking. The Senate still meets here, but their debates grow thinner, their words weighed down by the emptiness echoing through the streets. And still you walk. The eternal city breathes faintly, weakly, but breathes. Its belly groans, its people thin, its markets hollow, but the city clings stubbornly to life. Because that is what Rome does. And so your journey presses on, following the final meals of a city inching toward a new world it can neither escape nor fully comprehend. The morning light breaks dimly over the rooftops as you continue your journey. The city's wounds are deep now, but something unexpected stirs amid the ruins. Tonight you enter the quiet transformation of Rome's food world, as a new force slowly reshapes not just what is eaten, but why the rise of Christian fasting. The siege years may come and go. The invaders may plunder and withdraw. But within Rome's shrinking neighborhoods, another quieter revolution takes place around every table. You arrive at a humble gathering inside a villa courtyard, where a small group of Christians shares a simple meal: bread, water, olives, and lentils. No roasted dormice, no imported spices, no honeyed dormice or flamingo tongues. Historians still debate exactly how quickly Christianity reshaped Rome's food habits. But one thing is clear. The early Christians viewed food not as a stage for excess, but as an exercise in restraint, humility, and spiritual focus. You sit quietly near the gathering, observing how these believers begin their meal with prayer, thanking God for sustenance even as the portions are modest. The bread is coarse, barley, not wheat, and the oil drizzled across it is plain and unperfumed. A clay jug holds simple spring water instead of heavily spiced wine. The feasts that once displayed power now feel foreign to this community. For them, simplicity is strength. Self-denial is virtue. You hear one elder softly explain the rules of fasting to a younger convert. On Wednesdays and Fridays we abstain from meat and rich foods. He says not for want but for reflection. The flesh must not master the spirit. The contrast with the Rome you've walked before is staggering. The opulent banquets, the extravagant imports, the reckless indulgence of the patrician class, all replaced here with deliberate restraint. Historians still argue whether this shift toward simplicity was entirely religious or partly a pragmatic response to the economic and political disintegration surrounding the city. As the empire shrank and wealth disappeared, even those not fully committed to Christian doctrine found themselves naturally eating less or being forced to. You stroll through the forum, noticing small stalls where vendors now offer more dried beans, flatbreads and pulses than the exotic meats and imported spices once flaunted here. The demand has changed, shaped by both scarcity and shifting values. You pass a butcher who now sells far fewer cuts of meat, with many of his customers asking only for fish, and even then only on certain days. The rhythm of fasting days begins to regulate the city's food markets as Christian influence expands. You pause before a fishmonger's stall, where baskets of salted herring anchovies and small freshwater fish await buyers. The ichthys, the fish symbol, has become more than a secret sign of faith. It now governs entire trade routes, even in wealthier villas, where gold still glimmers faintly. Tables grow plainer. Hosts serve stewed vegetables, barley porridges, and simple fruits. Modesty becomes fashionable, not just pious. You approach a monastery rising beyond the old market walls. Within its simple kitchens, the monks prepare their daily meals: thin vegetable broths, honey-sweetened porridge, dried fruit and flatbread. No sauces, no luxuries. Their work in the fields sustains them, creating small closed loops of self-sufficiency. Historians still debate whether these early monasteries preserved Roman agricultural knowledge or allowed much of it to fade. But one thing is certain: their fields, gardens, and disciplined diets became models of resilience in an empire losing its grasp on global trade. The shift reaches into the calendar itself. Feasts tied to pagan harvest festivals give way to Christian holy days. Lent, Advent, and weekly fasts slowly organize the year's rhythm, regulating food consumption, not by abundance but by discipline. You overhear a priest preaching quietly near a fountain, reminding his small congregation that gluttony is a sin, that indulgence blinds the soul. He quotes scripture: "Man shall not live by bread alone." The message is clear: food remains essential, but its role has changed. No longer a stay for power, it becomes a tool for humility, a reminder of spiritual hunger, far greater than physical appetite. Even the great imperial banquets, once bloated with absurdity, shrink into symbolic gestures. Gone are the circus-sized extravaganzas of earlier emperors. The new Christian rulers, more often generals than patricians, prefer piety over peacocks, duty over excess. And yet, beneath the simplicity, you still sense the Roman ingenuity adapting. Lentil stews now feature wild herbs from the nearby hills. Fish are pickled and preserved with surprising care. Even honeyed date cakes remain thinner, smaller, but sweet enough to make the children smile. Historians still debate whether this new food culture softened Rome's resilience or created a more adaptable population. But you can feel it: this quiet austerity becomes its own kind of strength. The eternal city no longer shouts through its banquets. It whispers through its fasts. And as the moon rises above the shrinking skyline, you continue your journey forward, deeper into the last fading echoes of Rome's once endless appetite. You leave the humble monastery behind and wander deeper into Rome's changing streets, where the final layers of its ancient food courts slowly dissolve into something entirely new, or rather something much older, returning in a different form. Tonight you witness how the collapse of empire gives way to local rural resilience. The city no longer pulses with the roaring energy it once did. The great trade fleets no longer dock at Ostia as they once had. The endless parade of exotic foods from Africa, Asia, and distant islands has dwindled to a mere trickle. But life finds a way, and so too does food. You enter a small neighborhood market, far humbler than the Macella of old. Here, trade happens face to face, family to family, mostly among people who have known each other for generations. There are no great merchant corporations left. There are no imperial warehouses bursting with surplus. But there is food. You watch as a woman barters a sack of dried lentils for a wheel of soft goat cheese. A farmer lays out bundles of leeks, onions, and garlic hardy crops that survive indifferent weather and depleted soil. Another man carries a wooden cage filled with squawking chickens offering eggs or meat to those who can pay. Historians still debate whether this return to localized food economies was a collapse or a natural correction, a survival instinct born from necessity rather than ideology. Rome's massive central markets were always vulnerable to disruption. These neighborhood stalls, by contrast, depend only on the neighboring hills, gardens, and flocks. You approach a baker's humble stand. The bread is rough now, made from whatever flour can be ground, spelt barley oats. The fine wheaten loaves of old Rome are gone, but the smell of baking bread still warms the air. You see flatbreads and small dense loaves marked with thumbprints, practical feeling, and resilient. The city's diet now mirrors the countryside. Meat has become rare, again reserved for holy days and wealthier tables. Dairy grains, legumes, and wild greens fill most bellies. Pottage, that eternal stew of whatever happens to be available, bubbles gently in countless clay pots across the city. You pause at a small group of children, nibbling on roasted chestnuts, giggling as they toss the shells into the gutter. The chestnuts were likely gathered from the hills outside the city, another quiet thread in the shrinking but persistent web that keeps the eternal city alive. Even olive oil, once pouring into Rome by the amphora load from North Africa and Hispania, is now pressed in smaller batches from nearby groves tended by smallholders and local estates. The great commercial oil empires have fractured, but the trees still yield their fruit. Historians still argue how much knowledge was lost during these years. Some agricultural techniques vanished. Others quietly adapted, blending Roman methods with local traditions. What remains remarkably intact is the deeply Roman instinct for practicality: grow what grows, preserve what lasts, and trade what you can. You wander into a side alley where an elderly woman tends to a rooftop garden, clay pots sprouting parsley, rosemary, thyme, and mint. The scale is tiny but the resourcefulness enormous. Even in a city stripped of grandeur, the knowledge of how to feed oneself persists. The city's religious calendar now shapes its meals more than trade schedules. Feasting happens on saints' days. Fasting dominates much of the year. Boiled beans, root vegetables, salted fish, and dense rye bread make up the staples. The culinary theater of Rome's old days, the absurd performances of gluttony, is no longer even remembered by many of these new generations. You pass a crumbling villa, repurposed into a communal storehouse. Inside, large earthen jars hold grains, dried fruit, and nuts, a collective safeguard against bad seasons. With no state annona to fall back on, communities have learned to pool what little surplus they can. The market still hums, not with wealth but with cooperation. A leatherworker trades sandals for preserved meat. A shepherd exchanges wool for dried apples. Children carry baskets between households, ferrying small bundles of goods, as barter agreements shift week to week. Historians still debate whether this localized, ruralized Rome should be seen as decline or as resilience. You sense both. The loss of global grandeur is undeniable, but so too is the quiet determination of people who refuse to let their city starve. The air grows cooler as evening settles. You pass a group gathered around a communal fire sharing bowls of pottage, thickened with barley and cabbage. The conversation is soft about weather, about planting, about the survival of next season's lambs. Rome, you realize, has become a collection of villages, stitched loosely together by ancient stones and fading memory. Its food courts are no longer vast public spaces, but tiny courtyards, alleys, and rooftops, each a miniature ecosystem, balancing on the edge of uncertainty. And yet the city breathes. The eternal city has always been above all a master of reinvention. As you leave the market behind, you feel the quiet heartbeat of a civilization that refuses to vanish, one loaf, one stew, one barter at a time. Your journey continues. Rome still has lessons to whisper in the flicker of its embers. The city grows quieter still as you continue your walk, but not dead. Never dead. Rome's voice has only grown softer, less boastful. Now you enter the final surviving pocket of its food courts, the great estates, where remnants of the old elite have retreated into fortified luxury, while the outside world fractures further. You approach one such villa, a sprawling compound of stone walls, high gates, and private guards. Inside, the estate is oddly vibrant, a small, self-contained world. This is the new nobility, not the senators of marble forums, but landed aristocrats who now rule by proximity, not politics. Their food tells its own story of survival. The villa's gardens stretch in orderly rows, bursting with fava beans, onions, turnips, and herbs. The air carries the faint sweetness of ripening figs. Chickens cluck softly in fenced pens. Goats wander in small herds. A pig pen grunts nearby. This is not abundance in the grand imperial sense. No imported ostrich eggs or exotic pomegranates from Parthia, but it is secure. And that matters more now. Historians still debate whether these latifundia estates were symbols of post-imperial decay or ingenious adaptations to a broken system. What is certain is that they are now Rome's backbone. The global supply chains have crumbled. The land remains. You watch servants carefully harvest wheat, bundling it tightly for storage in cool underground granaries. These estates have learned to become largely self-sufficient, growing their own grain, pressing their own oil, curing their own meats. The systems that once fed millions now sustain only those who control the land directly. Inside the villa's kitchen, a small army of cooks moves with well-rehearsed precision. Clay ovens glow with steady heat. Loaves rise, pottage simmers, flatbreads cook on heated stones. The ingredients are simple, but there is skill in their preparation. A steward oversees the inventory amphorae of wine jars of salted fish, bundles of garlic hanging from wooden beams. His ledger is thin but orderly. Unlike the grand markets of old, everything here is measured and accounted for a closed loop, where waste can mean ruin. You glimpse a rare luxury, a small tray of dry dates, perhaps one of the few goods still traded from distant lands at great cost. Even as global networks falter, the last thin threads of long-distance trade stubbornly persist, like ghosts of the empire's former reach. The estate's lord dines with his household at a long wooden table beneath a colonnaded portico. The meal is respectable but modest roasted lamb seasoned with rosemary, boiled lentils, fresh cheese, figs, and flatbread. The wine flows, but it is local now. Not the famed vintages of distant Gaul or Campania. You notice no elaborate banquets, no acrobats or poets performing between courses. The focus is on stability. Extravagance invites risk. The world outside these walls grows unstable, and these lords know it. Historians still argue whether these aristocratic estates prolonged the life of Roman culture or marked its permanent shift into medieval feudalism. But here in this courtyard, you can see both happening at once. The villa's chapel chimes softly. Christianity, now fully woven into the fabric of daily life, shapes the rhythms of the table. Fast days are observed. Holy days are celebrated with extra loaves or sweetened cakes. Gluttony is frowned upon. The gods of the old Roman pantheon have long since vanished from these meals. You follow a servant into the villa's storage rooms. There smoked hams hang from rafters, cheeses cure slowly on wooden shelves, and sacks of beans rest under linen covers. Preservation is now an art of survival, not commerce. Outside the estate walls, tenant farmers work the surrounding fields under watchful stewards. These peasants no longer bring their goods to Rome's urban markets. Instead, their harvests feed the estate directly in exchange for protection and the right to remain on the land. You overhear one farmer speak of recent bandit raids, former soldiers, displaced peasants, or rogue war bands, desperate men who now prey upon the fragments of the countryside. The estate's guards keep them at bay for now, but the threat is constant. Historians still debate whether this transformation marked the death of Roman urban food culture or its rural rebirth. Here you see neither total death nor triumph, only adaptation. The marble forums are quiet, but the wheat still grows. The amphorae no longer sail in fleets, but oil is still pressed, bread still baked. As dust settles, the villa glows gently with oil lamps. The household gathers for evening prayers before their meal, giving thanks for the simple continuity of foodland and relative peace. In a world unraveling, this fragile order becomes the highest luxury of all. You step back into the fading light, leaving the estate behind. The great food courts of Rome are gone, but seeds of endurance remain scattered across villas, farms, and kitchen gardens. The eternal sadie's appetite may have shrunk, but it never vanished. And your journey continues, now entering the final breaths of an empire, learning how to survive without itself. The night deepens as you enter the last quiet corner of your long journey through Rome's vanished food courts. You now walk not into another market or villa or dockyard, but into memory itself. The physical city around you fades beneath the soft moonlight, revealing the ghost of what once was and the fragile beginnings of what will come next. You stand at the forum, its once crowded stalls, and shouting merchants long silenced. The marble columns still rise, but cracks run through their bases. Vines creep where awnings once shaded produce, stands bursting with figs, dates, and spices. A stray dog pads silently across the empty paving stones, its claws clicking in the hollow air. Historians still argue whether this moment, the late 5th century, is truly the fall of Rome or simply its shedding of imperial skin. But to your eyes, the changes are undeniable. The food that once defined this place has narrowed into simplicity, into necessity. The global food machine of Rome, the ports of Ostia, the fleets from Egypt, the caravans from Persia, the spice ships from India, all but gone. Yet even as the great arteries collapse, capillaries still pulse. You wander through what remains of a once grand Thermopolium. The counter still bears the circular holes where dolia once held bubbling stews. Now wildflowers sprout from their empty mouths. The echoes of ladles clinking against clay have long since quieted. The city's food culture, once built on scale, spectacle, and speed, has retreated into private kitchens, shared hearths, and whispered prayers before simple bowls of beans and barley. You pass a crumbling marble plaque that once listed imperial price controls, grain oil, wine meat. The numbers seem absurd, now relics from an economy that no longer exists. No state enforces them. No aedile walks the market with his tally stick. Historians still debate whether these controls prolonged Rome's survival or hastened its fragility. But now the debate is meaningless to those still here, baking barley loaves in clay ovens, drying grapes in sun-warmed courtyards, milking goats in crumbling villas. You follow a dirt path leading toward the city's edge, where clusters of new wooden huts have sprung up built from salvage beams pulled from ruined temples and forums. The residents here farm their own narrow strips of land, trading surplus eggs for wolfish, for onions, oil, for cheese. The markets of Rome have dissolved into a village economy governed not by state officials but by neighbors. You glance at a small family gathered beneath an olive tree. Their meal tonight is simple boiled lentils, a flatbread round a few figs, and a jug of thin wine pressed from a nearby vineyard. The children laugh as their father tears the loaf into pieces. The mother offers a quiet prayer of thanks. Rome's food culture has shifted from empire to household, from spectacle to survival. You walk further still, your sandals brushing dust from forgotten cobblestones until you reach the very boundary, where city and countryside now blur. In the distance, the hills that once framed Rome's grandeur stand silent but not indifferent. Crops still grow here. Goats still graze. Beekeepers still harvest honey from their small hives. The eternal city breathes, not as the imperial giant that once gorged on the world's riches, but as a collection of hands feeding mouths, one loaf, one pot, one egg at a time. Historians still argue where exactly to draw the line between Rome and what came after. But your walk has shown you that food leaves the clearest trail. The empire that once ruled by bread and circuses has given way to a patchwork of quiet resilience. And still beneath your feet, buried deep beneath layers of dust and ruin, the bones of the old food courts remain waiting for future hands to unearth their broken amphorae, their burnt bread ovens, their worn coins, once exchanged for lentils or salted fish. The eternal city did not starve. It shrank, it bent, it frayed, but it did not starve. As your journey slows, the final stars blink into the sky above you, distant but steady. And beneath them, Rome, battered, humble, quieter than it's ever been, still eats.